In November of 2017, I shared a story on YGS about my schnauzer, Mr. Riggs, who had returned from beyond to visit his home and family. The last time I sensed his presence was Halloween night of 2017, and I assumed that would be the final farewell. But, as it turns out, I was mistaken. There are signs that he has returned once more, and this story is about that return, and perhaps even more. I want to share this experience because it's something that really happened. It's real, and those who visit YGS come to hear real encounters. And while I can tell the story well enough, the mystery of what took place, of how it's even possible, still leaves me without clear answers. To begin, there was another loss, a new chapter of grief. The last of my 3 schnauzers, whom we called the Rascal, passed away on October 19, 2018. His death was not unexpected due to a long-standing illness, but it came faster than we'd prepared for, and in a way that was hard to witness. Once again, my family and I found ourselves mourning a beloved companion. But Rascal's passing is only part of this story. There are events I need to share that go beyond his death. To give you some context, Rascal had a set morning routine, one I attended to every day since he was blind and needed extra help. His morning involved feeding, watering, medication, and a trip outside. After finishing all that, I'd usually head for a hot shower to start my day. About 3 weeks before Rascal passed, I began hearing the unmistakable sound of clicking toenails in the hallway outside my bathroom door. Usually, that sound meant Rascal was making his way down the hallway, ready to be let out. With our laminated flooring, the sound of a dog's steps is clear and distinct. But when I opened the bathroom door, expecting to see Rascal, there was nothing. Rascal was nowhere to be seen. I brushed it off, not realizing at the time that I had just heard the same sounds I had once described in the story Mr. Riggs Walks. Mr. Riggs didn't even cross my mind then. I thought he was long gone, only a cherished memory. But those clicking sounds repeated a few times that week. 2 weeks before Rascal passed, the clicking grew more frequent. Every time I went to shower, I'd hear it. But Rascal was rarely the reason, as his health was rapidly declining and he barely moved around. By this time, the sounds doubled in frequency, tapping and clicking through the house as if something was trying to make its presence known. In the final week before Rascal's death, the sounds became almost constant. The day before he passed, I counted 5 separate times that I heard the clicking in less than an hour. Each time, I'd check on Rascal, and each time, he hadn't left his bed. He hadn't even stirred. His routine had been entirely abandoned, and he refused to eat or drink. I could sense that we were nearing the end. The noises left me confused and, admittedly, annoyed. I had my hands full caring for Rascal, and the interruptions meant that I'd have to check on him each time, worrying he might need to go outside. If he didn't, it meant I could get back to my shower and my morning coffee. At the time, my mind was focused solely on him. I never considered Mr. Riggs, or that the sounds could be something beyond my understanding. Finally, the day came. Rascal's condition worsened, and we took him to our vet. His doctor, who had cared for him through his illness, brought in another vet for a second opinion. Together, they confirmed it was time. Rascal had likely developed cancer in his liver or spleen, and to spare him further suffering, his life was gently brought to a close. Once again, we were heartbroken. To us, Rascal was more than just a dog. He was the last of our little family. With his passing, our home took on an air of stillness, almost like a tomb. The sorrow felt tangible, as though it hung in the air, and I felt the weight of loss in a way I hadn't before. All 5 of our friends were now gone. There were times afterward, when I was alone, that grief would overwhelm me. I'd find myself crying out, almost involuntarily, the sound raw and unfamiliar. In those moments, it was as though I heard a stranger's voice, and I came face to face with a new, wounded part of myself. I know that may not seem manly, but those 5 dogs had been with me, by my side, since 1974. They had shared my life, my home, even my bed, for over 40 years. We had shared a bond that ran deep, and suddenly, they were all gone. After Rascal passed, things started making more sense, though it took some time to connect the dots. Looking back, I believe it was Mr. Riggs walking the hall again, perhaps warning me of Rascal's impending departure. I suspect he was there for a reason, maybe to lead Rascal, his longtime friend, into the next life. They had lived their lives together, bound like brothers. I believe that love continued, even beyond the grave. But there is more to this story. On the nights of November 21st, 22, and 23, 2018, I was visited by the spirit of a dog. You could call it a ghost if you like. I don't know if I woke on my own to experience it or if something woke me, but each night, between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., I heard the same familiar sounds. The first night, there were 3 slow, hesitant footsteps on the laminated floor, as if the dog was uncertain. The second night, I heard 3 more footsteps, a bit stronger this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of sniffing, and then a snort as if the dog was clearing its nose. The third night, the steps were quick and steady, as if saying, "I'm out of here," and then silence. Each sound came from the foot of our bed, right near the side where I sleep. Rascal's bed still sits at the foot of ours, and I believe that late-night visitor was him. Perhaps it was his way of saying a final goodbye, a farewell we couldn't share while he was alive, since he'd been under anesthesia at the end. There's little more to tell. I don't know much about ghosts or spirits, and I don't claim to understand the mechanics of these things. I can offer no solid explanation, only my belief that this did, in fact, happen to me. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I have no idea what I could possibly be experiencing, and I'm not sure where to start. I just turned 20 on the 11th, and ever since I was young, my mother would tell me I got my intuitiveness from her. I began to understand what she meant after my first visual experience when I was about 6, down in Florida. I've always been a curious kid, to say the least. Around the age of 13 or 14, a friend and I were out in the backwoods of Kentucky, probably on land we shouldn't have been on, but that's how kids are. My friend mentioned an old Indian burial ground he knew of, and I couldn't contain my excitement. Far off the trails, on a hillside, lay large limestone rocks arranged over an obvious mound. We tried to dig around a bit, recklessly curious, to see what we might uncover. I figured that might be worth mentioning as some background and possibly a reason for some of the strange experiences I've had since. I also had an unusual encounter during a seance about a year ago in Plainfield, Illinois. My sisters and I decided to conduct a seance in a graveyard near our grandmother's house. We brought candles, my great-grandmother's cross, and 2 phones, one to record audio and the other to play white noise. We set everything on an obelisk-type gravestone with decorative supports at each corner. After asking our questions, we decided to go for a quick walk, leaving my phone recording and the white noise playing. We were only gone for about 10 minutes, but when we returned, the 10-hour loop video on YouTube had stopped. My sister's phone was fully charged, so it shouldn't have shut off. Feeling unnerved, we gathered everything and headed to my truck to listen to the recording. I wish I still had the audio, but despite losing it, my sisters and I are all witnesses to what we heard. As we listened, we clearly heard a female voice whisper my name, Bryce. It was faint, but unmistakable. Right after that, we heard the sound of one of the fancy metal supports clacking against the gravestone, even though we were nowhere near it at the time. Even spookier, the white noise had stopped right after we walked away. When we checked my sister's necklace, we discovered that the cross was missing. It held sentimental value, so we searched my truck and even returned to the graveyard the next day with flashlights. But it was gone. That night made me feel like I might be sensitive to spirits, more than most but certainly not an expert. Then, just 2 nights ago, something happened that left me shaken. My mom usually gets home from work around 11:45 p.m., but at around 10:40, I was in my room, listening to music at a decent volume when an ad came on. I decided to head to the bathroom across the hall, and my dog, Jack, got up to follow me. Just as I switched on the bathroom light and looked in the mirror, I distinctly heard a slightly distorted voice, almost in my mom's tone, say, "Hey Bryce." Took me a moment to process what I just heard. I've been off antidepressants since I was 12, was fully awake, and don't use anything that would impair me. I thought maybe my mom had come home early and had gone to set her things down in the kitchen. Jack's ears perked up, and his tail wagged excitedly. He took off toward the front door, as he always does when someone he loves comes home. Not wanting to be rude, I called out, "Hey Mom, you're home early. Everything okay?" But as I stepped into the hallway, Jack came back, his excitement fading. I realized something was wrong. Normally, Jack would go straight to my mom, jumping around on the wood floors, loudly, since he's about 50 pounds. Instead, he looked at me with confusion. My heart pounded as I went to the front door, choosing to sit there and try to calm down with a cigarette. This was the first time I'd heard an actual voice call out to me, although I've experienced doors closing or knocking sounds in other places. We've only lived in this house a month and a half, and it's already been strange. I couldn't help but wonder if the voice I heard was connected to the spirit that spoke my name during the seance recording. Mr. Riggs was the feistiest of the 5 schnauzers I've known over the years. He was headstrong, a bit of a scrapper, and didn't take well to correction. It wasn't that I was hard on him. He was just willful and independent. He wasn't what you'd call the pick of the litter, but his loyalty was unmatched. Over time, we became inseparable, as close as chilled peanut butter. He slept at my side, a constant companion. As he aged, he went from a fit, muscular dog to frail and weak. His eyesight faded, and he could no longer join me on walks around the farm or jump into bed. He developed a heart murmur, and a series of health complications followed. Ultimately, I made the painful decision to put him to sleep on January 17, 2017. He'd lived a long, good life, but saying goodbye was as hard as ever. For a month after his passing, grief weighed heavily on us. By the second month, we still felt the loss sharply, finding it hard to even speak of him. By the third month, we had begun to adjust, though the emptiness lingered, a permanent reminder of his absence. Then, something strange began happening. Came at night, always at night. To this day, I'm unsure if the sounds woke me, or if I woke up to hear them. It was footsteps in the hallway and sometimes in the kitchen or dining room. These areas had laminate flooring, and the distinct sound of dog claws clicking as they walk was unmistakable. Footsteps are like fingerprints. Each has a unique pattern and sound. I knew what I was hearing, yet couldn't fully believe it. The footsteps started around May 2017. I recall hearing them 3 times between May and August. Each time, I thought it was one of my other schnauzers, even though one was usually asleep on my bed and the other, who was blind, rarely ventured far. I convinced myself it could have been the blind one twitching in his sleep, his claws lightly tapping the floor. But that theory was shattered in August. In August 2017, I took a cruise to Alaska, and while I was away, my dogs were kenneled. I came home late at night and couldn't pick them up until the next day. So, the first night home, the house was empty, no dogs, just me. Though tired from the trip, I woke up in the middle of the night to the familiar sound of clicking claws on the floor. This time, the steps were louder, more urgent. As I lay there, it almost felt like Mr. Riggs was trying to say, "I'm here. Don't you see me? Get up. Get up." I had a choice. Stay in bed or get up and investigate. Truthfully, I was afraid of what I might find. Over the years, I've learned to be cautious about what I let myself see and experience, because memories of those things stay with you forever. Now, at 70, I have my share of memories that haunt me. I decided I didn't need another, so I stayed in bed, praying for my old friend. I asked that he find peace, that he move on to a place where he'd be loved and cared for. I fell asleep in the midst of those earnest prayers, hoping they'd be answered. The next morning, I woke up feeling an unexpected calm, as though my prayer had been heard. The house felt peaceful, and I felt as though a weight had lifted. But then Halloween arrived, October 31st, 2017, and something else happened. Some friends came to stay for a couple of days, bringing along their 2 schnauzers. With my 2, there were 4 schnauzers in the house. Just before dark, as we sat together in the living room, I heard the unmistakable sound of a dog drinking water from the bowl in the kitchen, about 12 to 15 feet away from where I sat. It was a loud, steady lapping, as though the dog was thirsty and taking a deep drink. Instantly, the two visiting schnauzers, young and full of energy, barked and dashed into the kitchen. My older dogs joined in, barking from where they sat. But as soon as the other dogs reached the kitchen, the sound stopped. All 4 dogs were accounted for in the living room, and yet we had all heard the sound of drinking from an empty room. My wife wasn't home that Halloween night, so she didn't hear it. But to me, the sound was unmistakable. It sounded like Mr. Riggs. When you spend over a decade with a dog, their sounds become as familiar as a heartbeat. The experience has left me pondering. I do have some psychic ability, a trait passed down from my mother, though I'm unsure if it played a role in this. Perhaps it was just the bond Mr. Riggs and I shared that allowed me to hear him once more. I don't know if I'd call this a ghost story. The word story feels wrong. It implies fiction, and every word here is the truth. I don't feel haunted, but I do feel Mr. Riggs is lingering, loyal as ever, perhaps just as reluctant to let go as I am. I hope he finds peace and a good place to rest, wherever that may be. I don't often talk about my spirit friend, but lately he's been pushing the limits, and I feel I need to share my experience. For the record, this is all true and I am of sound mind. It all began when I was about 8 years old. My older cousin had been dabbling in witchcraft, messing around with things she didn't fully understand. After one of her sessions, I started seeing things that I couldn't explain. It began with shadowy figures moving through the hallway. I'd run after them, thinking it was one of my siblings, but every time I looked, no one was there. As time went on, the activity escalated. I had planets hanging from the ceiling in my room, and one night they shook violently, swinging back and forth. I was 9, terrified, and after that night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in that room anymore. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, especially at night. I'd hide under my blankets, but that only made things worse. It felt like thousands of bugs were crawling up and down my legs. I'd also get this strange sensation in my ears, like snakes slithering up my ear canals into my brain. It was creepy and hard to ignore. This went on for about 2 years. Shadow figures, strange sensations, even small balls of black mist floating by. My siblings noticed strange things too, but it seemed like most of it was directed at me. When I turned 13, I experienced something unrelated but terrifying. I was nearly kidnapped by a man in a red car. The incident left me shaken, and even now, red cars send a chill down my spine. After that, though, I felt the presence around me start to change. It was as if he, whoever or whatever he was, became less menacing and more protective, even affectionate. First, it scared me. I started experiencing sleep paralysis, and during those episodes, I'd see bright, colorful lights and feel his presence nearby, watching over me until I broke free from the paralysis. By the time I turned 14, I felt a strange attachment to him, though I couldn't explain what he was. His presence made me feel calm, even safe. Then, one night, I had a strange, intense dream, an intimate, almost surreal experience. I woke up the next day confused, unable to shake what I'd felt. Curious, I researched incubus and succubus entities, but something told me that wasn't quite what he was. Fast forward to the present, and his presence has only grown stronger. He makes himself known while I go about my day, like when I'm cleaning or doing something mundane. I'll feel his touch, light, cold, and electric, like a zinging sensation that sometimes brushes against my calf, cheek, or even the top of my head. Sometimes, it's a full embrace from behind, a cold, firm presence that lingers. But at night, things intensify. He makes me feel things, and I don't know how to explain it, almost like an invisible pull that drives me to crave more of his presence. The sensations stop short of anything physical, but my dreams take a strange turn, shifting from pleasant fantasies to terrifying nightmares. Just last night, I was dreaming of sitting in someone's lap, a harmless scene, when suddenly, as if someone flipped a switch, I was in front of my dresser mirror. Pale, bony hands were playing a piano that had somehow appeared in my dresser drawer. A voice warned me not to look up into the mirror, but I did, and there I saw a face with hollow, black eyes, repeating over and over, I'm sorry I showed you my black eyes. I jolted awake, my heart pounding, and without thinking, I started singing Jesus Loves Me over and over. It was unsettling, as if the song was a taunt. The fear was real, but part of me craved more, and that craving scares me. Recently, I've been feeling an intense weight on me, especially when I lie down. It's as if a heavy, vibrating pressure sinks onto me, pulling me deeper and deeper until I'm paralyzed. I've even experienced it in public, once in a hotel room, where I forced myself awake by jerking my head to break free. I wake up feeling cold, a prickly sensation that leaves me drained. I hear him call my name too, but I have no name to call him by. Just a few hours ago, while I was working on something, I felt him trying to pull me into sleep, a fatigue so strong I could barely keep myself upright. I had to sit down on all fours just to shake it off. Right now, as I write this, I feel him close by, watching, waiting, and it's hard to ignore. I'm a Christian, though admittedly not a perfect one, and I feel torn. I know spirits can imitate loved ones, and I've heard warnings not to acknowledge them if they call your name. But here I am, hopelessly attached, and I don't know what to do. Out of all the strange experiences I've had, there's one that still haunts me to this day. The memory is so vivid, it feels like it could have happened yesterday. Maybe it's because it scared me so deeply that it's hard to forget. I was 17, living in the old Langley home in Floyd County, Kentucky, with just my mom and little brother at the time. We'd been in that house for a few years when I started noticing strange occurrences, mostly centered around my bedroom. These incidents would sometimes happen during the day but were far more frequent at night. My dog, who used to stay with me in my room, suddenly refused to come in. I'd feel an overwhelming sense of being watched, as though a dark presence was constantly near me. Sometimes, I'd feel the weight of someone sitting at the foot of my bed, regardless of whether I was awake or asleep. Once, I was asleep at the end of my bed, lying on my right side, when I felt the bed sink next to me. I thought it was my mom sitting beside me, but when I woke up, no one was there. Over time, I started to isolate myself, pulling away from everyone and everything. It was as if this presence had an addictive pull. I wanted it to stop, yet a part of me was oddly drawn to it. Felt like I knew what to expect, and yet I didn't. Late one night, I was sitting on my bed, listening to music when a sudden, intense feeling came over me. I switched off the music, and in the silence, I heard a low growl in my right ear. My soul nearly jumped out of my body that night. A month went by after that incident. One evening, I got up from my bed, walked over, shut and locked my door, turned off the light, and settled back under the covers. About 15 minutes later, I was lying on my left side, replying to messages on Facebook, tired and ready to sleep. Just as I reached over to plug in my phone, the room grew intensely cold. All the hairs on my body stood up, and I felt a deep chill, as if the temperature had plummeted. My breath was visible in the air, and I was so frightened it felt like I was moving in slow motion. In my mind, I was repeating, "Oh no, what is this?" I lay back, turning onto my back, and as I looked to my right, I saw a misty, glowing blue arm stretched out beside me. The fingers were delicate and faint, like a woman's hand. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. She was transparent, and though I couldn't see her full form, the shape of her arm suggested a woman. I also heard a strange sound radiating from her, a low, pulsing hum that reminded me of binaural beats or frequencies. And then, just like that, she vanished. The room went dark, the temperature returned to normal, and I lay there, frozen and speechless, thinking, what the heck was that? For days, I couldn't make sense of what I'd seen. Every night, I'd lie in bed, questioning if it had really happened. A few more nights passed, and I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. That familiar feeling of not being alone washed over me. But this time, it was different. I felt a warm, gentle pressure, as if an arm had wrapped around me. For 3 minutes, I felt safe, comfortable, and completely at peace. I'm 57 years old and have spent several years with a paranormal research group, gaining insight into how to attempt communication with the other side. It's a subject I take seriously, as my own life has been shaped by profound events. Perhaps the most significant of these was discovering, at age 40, that I was adopted, a revelation that came as my mother was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's and my father's health was deteriorating. I had always suspected, but my father was a self-absorbed, narcissistic man who refused to confirm it. My mother, by then, couldn't even remember her own name. When I finally found concrete proof, my father admitted the truth. His words were as cold as they were blunt. He had saved me because no one else wanted me. It was all about him, of course, his grand act of rescue. But the real story I uncovered was entirely different. My birth parents were from another part of the state, poor but desperate to keep me. My adoptive father, too old to go through legal adoption channels, found a way to arrange an under-the-table adoption. With the help of a crooked judge and social worker, I was taken from my birth parents against their will. They grieved for me for the rest of their lives, and my birth mother never stopped talking about her love for me or hoping that somehow, somewhere, I was okay. Present time. Years later, equipped with knowledge from my research group, I felt a need to reach out to my birth mother. I'd often talk to her aloud, especially as I lay in bed at night, saying her name in hopes she might hear me. Elizabeth J. From town, Kentucky, I would say, "This is your son, Randy. I'm trying to communicate with you. If you can hear me, please do anything you can to let me know you're there." Over the next few weeks, 3 events happened that I can only describe as unforgettable. The first experience. One evening after my nightly plea, I was sitting up in bed and reached for my phone on the nightstand. Just as I put it down, a strange stillness settled over the room. It was as though the entire world paused, an unnatural quiet that made me feel intensely aware of my surroundings. Suddenly, I felt a presence at my right side, near the bottom corner of my bed. I looked but saw nothing visible. Then, an unexpected sensation washed over me. A mild vibration began to hum through my body, like an electric current but not shocking. It's difficult to describe, but it was a gentle, buzzing warmth, almost soothing. I whispered, "Mother, if that's you, come closer." Instantly, the vibration intensified tenfold. My whole body felt as though it was humming with energy, like a chihuahua trembling with emotion. In that moment, a profound sense of warmth and safety enveloped me. It was like being cradled by a mother or grandmother, held close in an embrace that radiated unconditional love and protection. Tears streamed down my face as I surrendered to this feeling, overwhelmed with a sense of release. I'd never felt anything like it, and the experience left me stunned and speechless. For days, it was all I could think about, the second experience. About a week later, I decided to try using EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, to see if I could capture any sign of her voice. Night after night, I asked if she could hear me, hoping for a response. Finally, I played back a recording and heard a faint, but unmistakable, "Yes, son." The confirmation, even as a whisper, filled me with a quiet certainty. The third experience. One morning, around 4 a.m., I got up to use the bathroom. When I lay back down, drifting in that half-asleep, half-awake state, I heard a gentle, female voice in my head say, "Randy, I'm here." She sounded close, as if speaking directly to my mind. I didn't need to speak. It was as if she could hear my thoughts. In the background, I could hear other voices, faint and indistinct, like the murmur of a crowd. Curious, I asked, "Who are all those people talking?" "They are some of your relatives," she replied, her voice calm and warm. I thought of my family and asked if she knew she had twin granddaughters. Her response was simple, "Of course I know. We talked about meeting one day, and she reassured me, saying that when my time came, she would be there, happy to welcome me, not out of any morbid anticipation, but from a place of love." Her final words lingered with me long after. She promised she would always be near, always listening, and that she loved me deeply. Then there was silence. The memory of her voice is what stays with me the most. Without the limitations of a physical body, Her voice was like nothing I'd ever heard, clear, pure, almost musical. It resonated with a beauty and clarity beyond earthly sound, as if she were speaking from another realm. Reflection. I'll be the first to admit that some or even all of these experiences could be explained as wishful thinking. I wanted desperately to know her, to feel her presence, and to make up for the years we were denied. And I know the dangers of interpreting events during that hazy pre-sleep state. But even with those doubts in mind, my instincts tell me this was real. In my heart, I believe these were genuine connections, and they've left a lasting imprint on me, as real as anything in this world. For several months, I worked at a preschool. When I first started, another teacher, let's call her Annie, mentioned that the school was haunted. At first, I assumed she was just trying to spook the new girl and brushed it off. Looking back, I wish I had taken Annie's warning more seriously. The first strange experience happened during nap time. I was changing a child's diaper while the other kids in the room were fast asleep, and the lights were dim. The boy I was changing, let's call him Greg, began waving at the ceiling above me. I assumed he was just being playful and waving at me, but then he started babbling and laughing. Curious, I asked, "What are you waving at, Greg?" His response still chills me. He looked up, pointed toward the ceiling, and said, "Lady." Greg wasn't even 3 years old, so I was about to brush it off as a child's imagination until his smile faded, and he added, "Now man." Shortly after that, I was once again trying to help Greg fall asleep by patting his back while another boy, we'll call him Jamie, was already dozing on the mat next to him. As I hummed softly, Jamie suddenly sat up, a huge smile on his face, and started waving at the door to the classroom. Thinking he'd heard someone enter, I turned around, expecting to see one of the principals or another teacher. But the door was closed, and there was no one there. When I turned back, Jamie had already laid back down, drifting off as if nothing had happened. I was certain that if anyone had come in, I would have noticed the light from the hallway or seen a figure moving. The moment left me feeling unnerved. A few weeks later, after a conversation with one of the principals who confirmed that others had experienced strange things in the school, I tried to move past the incidents with Greg and Jamie and focus on my job. One evening, I was cleaning a classroom with the last child of the day, a 1-year-old I'll call Ian. I realized I needed to return something to another room, so I took Ian by the hand and guided him down the hall. Ian, being a well-behaved child, held onto my hand and clung to my pant leg while I put the item away. Just as I was about to leave, a large stack of papers flew across the room, right past us. There was no way Ian could have thrown them. He wasn't strong enough to lift the stack, let alone with one hand. Startled, I picked Ian up and hurried back to the other room. But later that evening, I returned to clean up the papers, still shaken but not wanting to leave a mess for another teacher. This time, the stack stayed where I left it. The final event occurred once again during nap time. I was helping another child, we'll call him Liam, settle down while another boy, Michael, lay nearby. Michael would only fall asleep if no one was too close, so I focused on Liam, glancing occasionally to make sure Michael stayed on his mat. As I turned my head, I caught a glimpse of brown hair peeking over the side of the changing table. Assuming Michael had gotten up, I sighed, stood, and walked around the table. But when I got there, I found Michael fast asleep. A chilling realization hit me. None of the other children had brown hair, and none were tall enough for me to see their heads over the table from that angle. Each of these experiences left me rattled, and while I'm still not certain what I encountered, I know one thing. I wish I'd listened to Annie's warning. I've never been especially drawn to the supernatural, and I'm generally a bit of a skeptic. Seeing is believing doesn't quite cut it for me. I'm more cautious about things I can't explain, but I'll get into that a bit more in a moment. I never gave much thought to the possibility of a supernatural realm, or any overlap with ours until I was about 12. I wasn't the kind of kid who was afraid of the dark or worried about ghosts or monsters under the bed. That all changed, though, when we moved to a new house that happened to be next door to a church and cemetery. This cemetery, where my maternal grandfather and his parents are buried, was separated from our house by just a narrow strip of woods and a parking lot. At first, I wasn't afraid of it at all. A couple of months after we moved in, I had my first experience. I hesitate to call it supernatural because I'm not entirely sure. Could have been stress, a half-waking dream, or just my imagination, but it felt incredibly real at the time. I was asleep, though I'm not sure of the time, when I woke up to see my younger brother standing at the foot of my bed. He was about 10 then, 2 years younger than me, and I assumed he'd had a bad dream and come to my room for comfort. But he just stood there, facing across the length of the bed, not saying anything. It lasted only a few seconds before I realized something was off. That's when it hit me that whatever I was seeing, it probably wasn't my brother. I froze in fear and called his name, but whatever had been there, if anything had truly been there at all, was simply gone. One moment I saw it, and the next there was nothing. I lived in that house from the time I was a preteen until I graduated high school, moving out as soon as I could. The longer I lived there, the more uneasy I felt. I suffered from insomnia and had nights where I'd lie awake for hours, or, if I did manage to fall asleep, would wake up exactly on the hour, 2:17, 3:17 for 17 a.m. and so on. This happened frequently, and though I realize that sounds hard to believe, it's the truth. Waking up like that, exactly on the hour, was unnerving and exhausting. When I couldn't relax in the house and couldn't sleep, I'd sometimes go to the cemetery to sit by a particular gravestone. Not a family member, but a weathered old stone in a sunny spot that felt peaceful. I'd read, write in my diary, or just sit quietly. Eventually, though, things became so overwhelming that I was desperate for relief. One day, in a moment of sheer frustration, I went to the cemetery, sat by that stone, and broke down, pleading with whatever presence was in the house to leave me alone. I even promised I'd keep visiting if it would just stop following me home. Whether it actually worked or simply gave me peace of mind, the uneasiness did subside for a while. But the peace didn't last, and I stopped visiting the cemetery altogether, growing more afraid as time went on. I became a wreck, spending as little time at home as possible, taking up smoking and other things just to cope. There was only one other visual experience in that house. I woke up in the middle of the night, turned to face the wall, and suddenly felt an intense wave of fear. When I glanced back over my shoulder, I thought I saw a woman's face in the corner of my room. This happened shortly after a friend and I had decided to have a séance and used a Ouija board. Another moment that still creeps me out. Besides that, I occasionally heard strange sounds and felt uneasy, but I never saw anything clearly again. A couple of years ago, I moved into my current place with my husband and son. I've only ever lived in a few places where I felt truly at ease, and while this place isn't outright terrifying, I don't feel entirely comfortable here. Only recently have I managed to sleep with my back to the room and the doorway. Shortly after we moved in, I noticed that the light in my son's room would flicker. It started out occasionally, but over time it worsened to the point of constant flickering, dimming, and sudden flashes. A few weeks ago, I was in his room, and the flickering was driving me nuts. Without thinking, I snapped, "Would you stop that, please?" The light flickered a few times, steadied, then flickered once more before stopping altogether. Since then, it's been mostly steady. I know it could be a coincidence, probably is, but it made me wonder. Strangely, it seems like there's been a trade-off. While the light has mostly stopped flickering, I keep catching brief glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye. It's never clear or directly in my line of sight, just quick flashes that vanish as soon as I notice them. It doesn't scare me, but I can't help wondering if it's my imagination or something else. One last experience happened just a few mornings ago. It was early, daylight filtering through the blinds, and I was lying in bed with my son since my husband was already at work. I opened my eyes for a moment and distinctly saw something round, black, and transparent hovering in front of me. It was a strange sight. I should mention that I had a brain hemorrhage a few years ago, which left me with some vision issues, so this might be related to that. However, I've never seen anything quite like it before, and it's been years since I've experienced any notable vision problems. All of this has left me feeling curious but also unsure. If there's something more here than just my family and our dog, I'd like to know. Part of me wonders if I've shut down the seeing part of myself out of fear, as if I can't fully believe in it anymore because it's easier not to. My twin sister and I were in first grade, walking to and from school with our two older sisters and our brother. Usually, there was a whole group of us kids, laughing and talking as we made our way home. On this particular day, about 7 or 8 of us stopped in front of our house, still chatting and giggling before heading in. My dad worked at the coke ovens in a small town called Allegheny, about 3 miles away, while my mom and her friend ran a restaurant nearby. Looking back, I guess we were some of the original latchkey kids. As we stood there, one of the kids in our group suddenly pointed at the front window and asked, "Who's that standing in the window?" We all turned, and sure enough, there was a man looking out the window at us. It didn't seem alarming at first. We had a big extended family, and sometimes relatives would stop by, and my mom would leave them a key if she or my dad weren't home. But none of us recognized this man. Curious, we headed inside, only to find the front door still locked. We called out, hollering through the house, but no one answered. We searched every room but found no sign of our mysterious visitor. An hour or so later, we were out in the backyard playing ball with some friends, including some of the kids we'd walked home with. Suddenly, one of them pointed to an upstairs window and shouted, "There he is again!" And there he was, watching us from the window. Let me pause to describe this elusive figure for you. He was tall, with black hair, wearing dark horn-rimmed glasses and a brown suit, a rare sight in our small eastern Kentucky coal camp. We decided to split up to try and find him. One group went in through the back door, the other through the front, locking the doors behind us. We searched the house from top to bottom again, but he was nowhere to be found. The doors were still locked from the inside, so there was no way he could have slipped out. Our friends decided it was time to leave, some heading home immediately, others lingering a bit longer before wandering off. Eventually, it was just my sisters, my brother, and me, and if we'd had somewhere else to go, we probably would have left too. Over time, we saw this mysterious man several times, but I'll share the incident that sticks with me the most. One day, I was pestering one of my older sisters, just doing my job as the younger sibling, and she reached her breaking point. Knowing that retreat was the best option, I ran through the house and down into the basement. Under the basement stairs was a small enclosed storage space that I'd claimed as my hideout. I dashed around the corner and into my hideout, reaching up to pull the chain of a light bulb that hung from the ceiling. As the light flooded the small space, I froze. Just 2 feet away from me stood the tall man with the horn-rimmed glasses, staring straight at me. I turned and ran, smacking right into my sister, who had followed me. I stammered out what I'd just seen, and we both turned back to look. He had vanished once again. We began telling people in the neighborhood that we thought our house was haunted. One elderly lady, who seemed as old as time itself, told us that years ago, a man matching our description had lived there. He'd been the superintendent of the mining operation and had been killed in the mines long before we moved in. Our house had once been the company clubhouse, where the superintendent lived and where visiting company officials stayed when they were in town. All this happened around 1953 or 54, but I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. Not long after, we moved out of the house, and one of my dad's friends rented it. About a month later, he came by to visit and asked if we'd ever seen anything strange there. He went on to describe the same man we'd seen, the tall man with black hair, wearing dark horn-rimmed glasses and a brown suit. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Since I can remember, strange things have always happened to me and my family. We lived in a house out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods. My mom told me we'd moved out there because the previous owner had died in a car wreck down the road. It wasn't until years later I found out the truth. The man had actually died of a heart attack while showering when his family was away. Long before I knew how he really passed, I'd already noticed eerie things happening. At night, I'd hear footsteps coming down the hallway, followed by the sound of the doorknob rattling as if someone was trying to come in. I'd get up to check, only to find no one there, just fresh footprints in the thick carpet. Later, we discovered my room had belonged to the man's 6-month-old daughter. One day, my mom was in the shower when suddenly, the shower head, which was rusted and barely adjustable, flipped straight up to the ceiling. Nothing harmful ever happened, though. It was as if the man was just trying to live on in his home. After 3 years, my mom and stepdad decided to move us, my siblings and me, to a larger house closer to town. We hadn't even been there 3 months when strange things started happening again. It was similar to the last house. Footsteps, door handles rattling. But this time, it felt different. At 13, I finally had my own room in the basement. I used to sleep with the door open, all the lights off. One night, I was lying in bed facing the door when I started hearing voices. At first, I thought it was just my mom and stepdad talking upstairs. But then I realized it was 4 a.m., and I could hear my stepdad snoring through the floor. No one else was awake. Frozen with fear, I kept staring at the open door. The footsteps grew louder, along with a man's voice, until everything suddenly went silent. In the moonlight coming through the window, I saw a shadowy figure in the doorway. It said sleep, then slammed the door shut and locked it from the inside. This wasn't just a door handle lock, it was a deadbolt. After that night, I always kept the door locked, the lights on, and music playing in the background. Another day while I was at school, my mom was on the computer in the sunroom, which was right across from the basement door that we usually left open. Out of nowhere, the door closed. My mom, knowing she was the only one home, got up, opened it, and went back to her work. After about 10 minutes, it closed again, this time a little harder. Mom opened it back up, only for it to slam shut 10 minutes later with such force that it bounced back open. At that point, she decided to leave it closed. To this day, that door randomly opens and closes on its own. Then, in my freshman year, I was homesick with a stomach bug. My mom and I were watching the morning news in the living room. Our 3-year-old boxer, Sasha, had left her favorite squishy elephant toy on the coffee table. Out of nowhere, the toy flew across the room. My mom and I just stared at it. I finally broke the silence. "Did you see that, Mama?" She replied, "I did. I'm just waiting to see if it does it again." It never did, and for a couple of years the house went quiet. We thought whatever was going on had stopped. One evening in my sophomore year, I was at my friend Leah's house. We thought it'd be fun to make a homemade Ouija board. It seemed harmless at the time, though looking back, I realized how foolish it was. The only message we received was from a 22-year-old woman who told us to watch out. We laughed it off, not thinking much of it. A few months later, my mom had a baby girl, Zofia. With my stepdad working out of state, I often slept in my mom's bed to help with the baby. One morning around 5 a.m., I felt my mom jump out of bed. At first, I thought something was wrong with Zofia, so I sat up, but then I saw my mom standing there with her phone, snapping pictures with the flash on. She told me that a tall shadow had entered the room, walked over to the bed, then turned and walked out down the hall toward the kitchen. We checked, but no one was there and no one had been up. Just 2 hours later, while changing Zofia's diaper, my mom noticed 2 scratches down her back, like marks from nails. The baby had been asleep since 3 a.m., and there was nothing in her bed or her shirt that could have caused those marks. The footsteps and voices continued after that, but thankfully nothing else as unsettling. Fast forward to now. I'm 19, married, and moved out, but my mom still experiences activity at her house. Shortly after I got married, my mom called me on break at work. Zofia had woken up screaming, terrified. When my mom asked her what happened, Zofia replied, "The girl was in my bed, playing with my hair." My mom asked if the girl had said anything. Zofia, sniffling, replied, "She wants to play with me." She slept with my mom for a few nights after that before eventually going back to her own bed. This incident made me recall the Ouija board session with Leah. Ever since then, the footsteps and voices have only grown more active. A few weeks ago, I was at my mom's house. My 2 aunts, my nana, my mom, and I were in the basement sorting clothes for a yard sale. The babies were playing with toys behind us, and Sasha was asleep in the toy room with them. Out of nowhere, we heard glass shattering upstairs, followed by what sounded like someone jumping up and down. My mom grabbed Zofia, I picked up John, and we all rushed upstairs, followed by Sasha, who immediately started barking at an empty corner in the hallway with her fur raised. We found nothing broken, no glass anywhere, just that strange corner Sasha seemed to be fixated on. After she calmed down, we all went back downstairs. Since I was 13, I've been too scared to stay alone at my mom's house. Now, nearly 20, I still won't. But lately, I worry that whatever was there may have followed me to my new home. Things move or disappear only to reappear later, and I often hear banging in the kitchen at night. I've checked thoroughly for mice but found nothing. One night, when my husband was working late, I took our puppy Dixie outside. After bringing her back to bed, I lay down and was about to fall asleep when I felt the mattress sink on my husband's side. Thinking he was home early, I reached for the pistol by my side and sat up, but no one was there. The indentation in the mattress lingered for a moment before flattening back out. Unsure of what else to do, I said, "Can you please stop? You're really scaring me." Since then, nothing like that has happened, just the usual bumps and bangs. Activity at my mom's house is still going strong, and unless we get a priest involved, I doubt it will ever truly stop. I'm probably not the best at putting stories into words, so bear with me. One of my most unforgettable paranormal experiences happened right in my hometown, Richmond, Kentucky. It was a summer day in 2010, pretty ordinary by all accounts. Some friends and I decided to hang out at a local park, grab some lunch, and just chill. We picked up food from Wendy's, returned to the park to eat, and then wandered around for a while. In the center of the park is this old mansion, the Irvine McDowell House. There's a sign out front with its name, marking it as a historic building. After walking for a bit, we noticed a baseball game at a nearby field that's attached to the park, so we strolled over to watch. It wasn't all that exciting since we weren't huge baseball fans, so we wandered off pretty quickly. Eventually, we ended up sitting on the steps of the old mansion, just catching up on life, talking about work, and making weekend plans. After a while, a guy came up to us, introduced himself as Ben, and asked how our day was going. He started telling us some history about the house, when it was built, who lived there over the years, and finally about a family that supposedly died in the mansion. He didn't have many details, but we politely listened, assuming he was a college student trying to give us a bit of a scare since the park was on campus. Eventually, Ben left, and we all shrugged it off, thinking it was just a local trying to add some spooky vibes to an old building. Around 5 o'clock or 5:30, we decided to head home. It had been a long day, and we all had things to do. As we were walking away, about 10 feet from the house, I heard what sounded like someone tapping on a window. I stopped and asked my friends if they'd heard it, but they shook their heads. Curious, I turned back to face the mansion, convinced I wasn't imagining it. My friends thought I was just trying to spook them, but I insisted that I'd heard something. I scanned the windows, starting with the bottom and moving up to the top. And then, in the top right window, I saw something I'll never forget. There, staring down at us, was a little girl, maybe around 9 years old. She was in a white dress, her skin a sickly gray, with solid black eyes fixed straight on us. My friends saw her too, and none of us could move. We were frozen, locked in that moment, staring up at her, too scared to speak or even breathe. It must have been a full minute before someone else walked up and asked what we were looking at. We broke our gaze to answer them, mumbling something about just looking at the house. When we turned back, she was gone. Neither of us spoke another word. We all quietly walked to our cars and left. I'm sure there'll be plenty of skeptics, but every part of this is true. My friends and I still remember that day vividly, and I haven't gone back to that park since, and have no plans to ever go back. I'm not entirely sure where to start with this. I don't really remember when this shadow started following me or even the first time I saw it. It might be due to dissociation, which I experience as part of a long-standing psychological disorder. I do remember that my first experience with it happened when I was around 14, back when I lived in the housing projects in my hometown. One evening, I was alone. My mom was out, and my little brother and sister were at their dad's for the weekend. I was in my sister's room, tidying up her toys and changing her bedsheets, when I started feeling strangely drowsy. I sat on her bed and drifted off almost instantly. Suddenly, I woke up to the sensation of the mattress shaking. As I opened my eyes, I caught a glimpse of a shadow figure in my peripheral vision. The mattress slid halfway across the room with me still on it. Another experience happened when I was 16, in my basement bedroom. I lived in what was basically a small apartment in the basement with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room, and a bathroom. One night, I was folding laundry, and each time I turned away from the basket, I had this growing sense that something was watching me, moving closer whenever my back was turned. As I finished up, I took my last item to the closet when suddenly, the laundry basket was hurled across the room, hitting me in the hip. I was terrified and bolted upstairs to tell my grandmother, who had custody of me at the time. She shrugged it off and later told my little brother that the basket had been thrown because of my lack of faith. When I was 17, I had another encounter in the living room, near the door to my bedroom, where my desktop computer was. Unable to sleep, I was killing time on the internet, playing a game and chatting online. The house was completely dark, with only the glow of the screen illuminating my face. Suddenly, I felt an icy breath on my shoulder, and the computer shut off abruptly. Silence filled the room. Terrified, I called it a night and locked myself in my bedroom. At 17, I moved out, married young, and got an apartment across town. My husband was fascinated by the paranormal, and when strange things began happening, he enlisted the help of his friends on an investigative team. They checked out our apartment, an old house that had once been a funeral parlor, but only found noisy pipes. Nothing that could explain what I experienced next. One night, a few months after moving in, I woke up and saw black mist accumulating in the upper corner of our bedroom ceiling. I thought I heard faint whispers and, in my panic, woke my husband, but he didn't see anything. For a while, things went quiet. I attributed the incident to stress, marriage, bills, and other challenges had been weighing on me. But when we moved again a year later, something reawakened. My little brother came to spend the night, and since my husband was staying mostly with his mom by that point, I shared my bed with him. Deep asleep, I was suddenly jolted awake, unable to move. It felt like a crushing weight was pressing down on me, and when I opened my eyes, I saw the black figure looming over me, pinning me down. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then the figure opened a mouth lined with razor-sharp teeth, let out a chilling screech, and vanished. I checked to make sure my brother was okay, then stayed up playing on my phone, too afraid to sleep. Later, I was woken up by my brother gasping, struggling to move. I shook him awake, and through his tears, he described seeing the same figure pinning him down. He described every detail I had seen. By the time I was 20, I had separated from my husband and moved back to my grandmother's. I hadn't seen the entity in years and had mostly forgotten about it. But on May 16, 2011, I saw it again, standing in the corner of my grandma's room, watching her sleep. The next day, I heard the sounds of weeping echoing through the house. My sister and grandma heard it too. On May 18th, my grandma became uncharacteristically aggressive toward our family, and by May 19th, she was dead, her death ruled as brain death due to narcotics overdose. After that, I started seeing the entity more frequently, lurking in random corners of the house. Felt like it was whispering to me, urging me to end my life. For months, its taunts wore me down until, in a moment of despair, I attempted to overdose. Thankfully, my best friend and her mother found me in time and rushed me to the hospital. The entity seemed to fade away for a while after that until my best friend, now my girlfriend, moved in with me. Strange things started happening again. We'd hear tapping on the doors. The trash can would flip over in the kitchen. Doors and drawers would open on their own. And at night, we'd hear our names whispered. One night, when I was 23, every door in our house burst open, and we heard the sound of heavy footsteps, like they were coming from every corner. We searched the house and even called the police, but no one was there. We locked up everything and went back to bed, trying to make sense of it all. Nothing happened again until I was 25. My girlfriend and I got married and moved into her family's old home, a house built in the 1800s. Her family was fascinated with the paranormal and eagerly shared stories of strange occurrences. For a while, things were calm. But in September 2015, I started seeing the shadow again. For 3 consecutive nights, I woke up with the feeling of being watched, held down, and surrounded by whispers. My wife even witnessed it one night. There may be other incidents I've forgotten, but these are the ones etched vividly in my memory. I've been to doctors who've tried to chalk this up to sleep paralysis, dissociation, or other psychological factors. I've seen psychiatrists and counselors, but it doesn't explain everything. Others have witnessed these events too. I believe this entity is real and has been following me for years. I try not to acknowledge it, but the fear it brings is always there. This doesn't feel like sleep paralysis. It feels like something much more. My parents divorced when I was just 3 months old. My dad was utterly unstable, a raging alcoholic with a slew of psychological issues. He lived in Kentucky while my mom was in Pennsylvania, close to nearly all of her family. Dad, on the other hand, had very few family members nearby. On his side, there was his mom, his aunt and uncle, and me. He'd lost custody of his older son when he was just 3. I was with my dad on a court-ordered visit when my great-uncle passed away. Strangely enough, it happened on September 16th, the same day my grandfather had passed a few years earlier. My paternal grandmother was devastated. She'd loved her brother deeply. He was one of the last people she had left, though she could be a tough and bitter woman. I cared about him too. When I was little, I'd visit his home near Dayton, Ohio, where he had this custom-built train model in his basement. It was incredible, and I'd always been fascinated by trains, planes, and cars. Looking back, my memories of him are somewhat fuzzy, as I was still very young when he passed. What I do remember is that he was tall, over 6 feet, and had a quiet, gentle demeanor. One night, I was staying with my grandmother at her apartment. She had 3 cats, which wasn't ideal since I was terribly allergic. So, I was sitting on the futon in her dimly lit living room, trying to keep my distance from the cats. She had a sliding glass door that opened onto a ground floor porch, where her cats would occasionally go out. The blinds were half open, leaving just enough space for the porch light to cast a faint glow into the room. My grandmother was in her bedroom, reading from her prayer books, something she did every night. I don't remember what I was doing at that moment, only that the room was quiet, with the dark porch to my right. All of a sudden, I noticed a shimmering, dark shadow emerging from the glass door. The shadow was tall, towering over me, nearly touching the ceiling, and it glided smoothly across the room. I was paralyzed with fear, watching as it moved toward my grandmother's room. For some reason, all I could think of was my great-uncle. Then, I heard my grandmother scream from her room, breaking the spell. I darted down the hall and asked her if she'd seen it too. She nodded, as shaken as I was, and I felt a wave of relief knowing I hadn't imagined it. After a few moments of comforting each other, we both came to the same conclusion. It had to have been her brother, my great-uncle, paying a final, unmistakable visit. My grandmother had seen things like that on the ghost shows she loved watching, so it didn't seem impossible to her. Every so often, we talk about that night, and neither of us has ever questioned that it was her brother. We may never know for sure, but it certainly felt like his final farewell. Started small. Things would be out of place, and my father and I joked that he must be sleepwalking or just going senile. But then things got stranger. Lights left on would mysteriously turn off. Closet doors that we'd left closed would be found open. It was always subtle. Nothing that couldn't be chalked up to absent-mindedness or even one of the pets knocking something over. The house was only a few years old, and both my dad and I are logical people, so we tried not to dwell on it. One morning, I called my boyfriend and left my phone on my bed while I got dressed. When I returned from the closet, my phone was gone. I tore my bed apart, thinking it must have slipped under a sheet, but it was nowhere to be found. After an hour of searching, I finally gave up and went to the kitchen for breakfast. To my surprise, there was my phone, sitting right on the stove, where I definitely hadn't been yet that day. We brushed it off as forgetfulness, but this would be the first of many incidents. Items would go missing, only to reappear on the kitchen counter. It became a bit of a joke between my dad and me. We laughed, saying we had a spirit who helped us find our things, though neither of us really believed it. Then one day, I came home to find an outfit neatly folded and laid out on my bed. I had an interview that morning, but I hadn't worn or even taken out those clothes. I called my dad, confused and a little upset, wondering why he'd gone through my closet. But he denied it, saying he hadn't touched anything. We laughed it off again, joking that the spirit had a fashion sense. We decided to call it Francis, a neutral name so as not to offend. Francis became our household legend. Little things would keep happening, nothing too frightening, just small oddities that made us question our own sanity. I'd fall asleep on the couch with the windows open, only to wake up and find them shut, save one. I'd assumed it was my dad, trying to make sure I didn't catch a draft, but when I asked him, he looked genuinely confused. "Must be Francis," he joked. Yet I didn't really believe in Francis, until the day the lock moved under my hand. One evening, I'd gone out with a friend, leaving my keys at home since I didn't need them. When I returned, I entered through the garage, assuming the inner door would be unlocked. But to my frustration, it was locked. I jiggled the knob a few times, annoyed. My dad was gone, so he must have locked it on his way out, knowing I didn't have my keys. I called him, irritation boiling over, venting that he'd locked me out. But then he calmly replied, "I didn't lock the door." Something about his tone made the joke shatter. This time, it didn't feel like a simple oversight or a helpful gesture. I felt as though I'd been intentionally locked out. I dropped the phone and shook the knob, tears welling up in frustration. I leaned against the door, my forehead resting on it, and sighed, giving up. Just as I was about to apologize to my friend for the whole mess, I heard a small, soft knock from the other side of the door. I jumped, and then heard a faint click. Tentatively, I reached for the handle, and it turned easily in my hand. The lock had been released. My friend, having tried the door herself earlier, looked pale. She reached for her phone to call 911, assuming someone must be inside, but I stopped her. I knew there was no one else in the house. I could no longer deny Francis' presence. My friend, visibly shaken, asked what was going on. I hushed her, turned back to the door, and with as much calm as I could muster, lightly knocked and said, "Will you please let me in, Francis?" I'm not sure how long I stood there with my hand on the doorknob and tears streaming down my face, but then I heard the faint sound of the deadbolt unlocking. It wasn't smooth, there was a bit of struggle, but then silence. Gently, I turned the knob and opened the door. My friend screamed, expecting someone to be standing there, but the house was empty. Since that day, nothing as intense has happened. The little things still occur, like windows being mysteriously closed when I'm the only one home. People have suggested I cleanse the house or try communicating with Francis, but I don't feel it's necessary. This isn't my area of expertise, and besides, Francis has never made me feel truly unwelcome, just watched over in a way. Nothing it has done feels harmful except for that one day, which I now think was meant to prove its presence. We don't joke about Francis anymore. When something reappears on the counter, we just nod and say, "Thank you, Francis." I don't want to start by saying, I never believed in ghosts. I've always hovered between believing in the paranormal and dismissing it as fantasy. My biggest encounter happened about 2.5 years ago, and while it was a one-time event, small things keep happening that make me feel like I'm not alone. One night during the summer of 2012, I was on the phone with my boyfriend at the time. It was around 4 a.m. and we were chatting about random things, as we often did. I decided to go outside for a smoke and stepped out onto my small back deck. I sat down on the top step, lit a cigarette, and relaxed, facing down toward the stairs. I remember closing my eyes for just a second, and when I opened them, a face, gray and smoke-like, pushed itself right into mine. I could see its eyes, nose, lips, and an expression that radiated malice. I gasped and yelled, "Oh my God!" as this face moved through me. As it did, I heard a low growl, not an angry sound, but more like a deep, resigned sigh. Terrified, I jerked backward and fell against the porch, struggling to make sense of what just happened. My boyfriend kept asking what was wrong until I calmed down enough to speak. I tried to dismiss it as just cigarette smoke, but the cloud was the color of thunderclouds, a dark gray, while cigarette smoke is more of a bluish-white. I don't think I'll ever forget that face. Fast forward 2 years, and I had moved to Arkansas to be with a new boyfriend who was in the military. We shared an apartment close to his base, and though there were 4 of us living there, I often preferred spending time alone in the bedroom. But after a few months, I started feeling like I was being watched constantly. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night with an overwhelming feeling of coldness and dread filling the room. Lifting my head, I looked around to see if anything was there, and suddenly, I heard the loud metallic vibration of the spring door stopper, as if it had been bent back and released. The door was shut, but then it started to creak open slowly. My boyfriend was out in the living room at his computer workstation. Too scared to speak or move, I stayed still, believing that acknowledging a spirit would make it more active. After a deep breath, I got up, ran into the living room, and told him that something was in the room and I didn't want to go back alone. He just laughed it off and told me to go back to sleep. Another night, I was in the bathroom attached to the master bedroom, brushing my teeth. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something move. I turned around, but no one was there. I walked into the bedroom to check and heard a noise behind me. A water bottle had fallen off my boyfriend's gun safe, where it had been sitting untouched for days. The rational side of me tried to explain these encounters. I could argue that my first experience was just cigarette smoke, but that face was too vivid to brush off. The second incident with the door stopper might have been a fluke, caused by the pressure on the spring finally releasing. And the water bottle falling could have been from an imbalance or shifting weight in the room. But in my gut, I truly believe these were spiritual encounters. It was the summer of 2010, and my friends Travis, Matt, and I were excitedly leaving middle school behind, looking forward to starting high school in just a few weeks. We decided to hang out at Matt's grandma's house, where we planned to play some football and watch TV. Matt's grandma, who has since passed, was a very spiritual woman. Sometimes she'd tell us stories about strange things she'd experienced, like objects randomly moving or, once, a toy football helmet flying across the room. We'd listen, entertained, but quickly turn our attention back to more typical teenage concerns like girls and the start of high school. One night, the 3 of us were lying in a queen-sized bed in her guest room, where we usually slept when we stayed over. Matt was on the far left by the window, Travis in the middle, and I was on the right side, closest to the TV. We were drifting off to sleep when I heard a gentle tapping at the back of the bed. At first, I assumed it had to be something natural, maybe just the bed creaking, but the tapping was just persistent enough to keep me awake. Eventually, I made everyone put their hands and feet up to be sure it wasn't one of them. But the knocking only grew louder, becoming impossible to ignore. We were all starting to get uneasy. Fully awake by then, we decided to go outside to see if we could make sense of it. We knew 3 people had died near the property. A baby had passed in the trailer behind the house. A motorcyclist had died on the road after a tire blew out, and an older man had died in the yard after drinking himself to death. We figured maybe standing in those spots might answer some of our questions about what was going on. Since I was the youngest, they made me stand near the trailer where the baby had passed. Matt, being the oldest, stood in the yard where the man had died, and Travis stood by the road where the motorcyclist had lost his life. As I stood there by the trailer, a strange feeling crept over me. The ground before me seemed to spin and shift into a yellowish color, and I felt what seemed like cobwebs brushing against my face. The sensation was so intense that I panicked and ran back to meet up with Travis and Matt, breathless as I told them what I'd experienced. Then someone suggested we go up to the attic to continue our search for answers. The attic had a large window that overlooked the yard, and we figured maybe we'd catch sight of something. Once upstairs, we positioned ourselves by the window, Matt on the left, Travis on the right, and I stood in the middle, facing out. It was pitch black, but my eyes slowly began to adjust to the faint light from the window. I could see Matt clearly after a few seconds, but as I looked over at Travis, I noticed something odd. The harder I tried to see him, the less visible he became. His entire corner began to grow fuzzy, and gradually, it was overtaken by an almost blinding white fog. This fog didn't have a defined shape. It was large and oval-like, without features, limbs, or even a head. It was just a dense, almost shiny mist, and soon, I could barely make out Travis behind it. As I stared, frozen, the fog seemed to pulse and shimmer. Then, I heard a sharp, snake-like hiss coming from it. My heart racing, I bolted from the attic, with Travis and Matt close behind. We ran straight back to the bedroom, but as soon as we were back, the uneasy feeling vanished. The house felt completely calm, almost as if nothing had happened at all. To this day, that night haunts me. I can't bring myself to stare into the dark corners of my room for fear that my eyes won't adjust, and that if I look long enough, that shape, that mist, might return. My husband and I moved into a family-owned house not far from my parents. I've always been able to see ghosts and sense the paranormal, so I make a point to walk through a house to feel for any presence before deciding to live there. This house was different. During the walkthrough, everything felt completely calm, which was a first for us. Once we moved in, my husband began working a night shift, leaving me alone most days and nights. One night, while unpacking boxes in the kitchen, I just washed and put some plates away in the cabinet. I turned around to start on another box, and when I looked back, the plates were back in the box. For a moment, I questioned myself, thinking I must have imagined putting them away. I put the plates back in the cabinet and carried on, brushing it off as nothing. After settling in and getting the kitchen set up, I finally went to bed, falling asleep almost immediately. But at 4 a.m., I was jolted awake by faint music coming from the attic. I got up, opened the attic door, and climbed up to check, but there was nothing there. No music box or source of the sound. I brushed it off and went back to bed. For the first few months, nothing else happened, and I was relieved. But after about 3 months, things began escalating. It was clear that something was in the house, though I never saw any ghostly figures or apparitions. Whatever it was didn't want to be seen. One night, my husband was at work, and I was alone, watching TV on the couch, when a loud crash sounded from the attic. Startled, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and headed to the stairs. As I threw the attic door open, it slammed against the wall, and I climbed up to investigate. Halfway up, I felt a hand lightly push me. Not hard enough to knock me over, but just enough to make me stumble. Heart racing, I made my way to the top, but everything was in its place. No boxes had fallen. Then I noticed a small hole in the back wall of the attic. Curious, I went downstairs to grab my husband's flashlight and returned to the attic. When I shined the light into the hole, my blood ran cold. I was staring at a human skeleton. I screamed, ran downstairs, and called the police, then called my husband at work. The police arrived before my husband, and I found myself explaining what had happened over and over. The sheriff asked what had made me look in that particular spot, but I didn't have a real answer. I was simply searching for the source of the noise. By the time my husband got home, the house was crawling with officers. He came in just as they were bringing out the skeleton. A few weeks later, we received news from the police. The remains were those of a young boy, around 12 years old, and his death was ruled a murder. With facial reconstruction, they identified him from a missing person report filed nearly 30 years earlier. His name was John. This left me with questions about how John ended up in the house. Around that time, I began seeing spirits in the house. A man, a woman, and a boy. I was eventually able to communicate with them, learning that the boy was indeed John, while the man and woman were Oliver and Lily. Oliver was a distant relative, a mean, volatile man, and his wife Lily seemed tied to the old pedal-operated sewing machine in the attic. Lily didn't bother me. In fact, she seemed to protect me from Oliver. She and Oliver had a complicated history, as I soon learned. John was Oliver's son from an affair. When John came to Oliver as a child, claiming him as his father, Oliver had killed him to keep his secret. John had no living family left but me, my mother, and my grandmother. My family decided to give him a proper burial, wanting to finally lay him to rest. After John's funeral, it was clear that he'd moved on, finally at peace. The house felt lighter, and I thought that maybe, at last, I could live there comfortably. But that peace didn't last. The night my husband returned to work, I had finished cleaning up the house and went to bed. I awoke with the feeling of being watched. I forced myself to wake up fully and look around, and that's when I saw a figure standing in my bedroom doorway. It had the body of a man but with hooves for hands and feet, and the head of a goat. I was frozen with terror and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following evening, after my husband left for work, I was lying on his side of the bed when a knife came flying through the air, landing on my pillow. He arrived home early that night and found me on the porch, shaking. I told him everything. That was our last night in that house. As a medium, I know I'll always see and sense spirits, but I don't need to stay in a place where a ghost might want to kill me. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. This experience took place over several months. In the autumn of 2012, I was home from university for a weekend. On the outskirts of my town, there's an old graveyard called Red River Cemetery in Logan County, Kentucky. It's very old, the earliest graves date back to the 1790s, and deeply tied to local history. The Great Revival of 1800 took place there, the first camp meeting in Christian history, and a lot of spiritual activity reportedly happened during that event. I often visit this cemetery. The drive through the countryside is refreshing, and the graveyard itself is surrounded by ancient trees, giving it a feeling of timelessness. Toward the back, there's a reconstructed log church that adds to its historical ambience. You almost feel as if you're stepping back in time. It's usually quiet, still, and peaceful. In the center of the cemetery is a separate, walled family plot, enclosed by a wall dating back to the 1830s. The graves inside belong to an entire family, and one of them has partially sunken and opened up, possibly from vandalism or natural erosion. I wandered around the plot for a while, as I'd done many times before, but this time felt different. There was a subtle but growing feeling of discomfort. It wasn't overpowering, but I sensed that I shouldn't linger. I left the plot and continued my walk through the cemetery. That night, it all started. I suffered intense insomnia, drifting in and out of an uneasy half-sleep, but it felt as if my mind was under siege. Out of nowhere, the image of two specific graves from that family plot seemed burned into my mind, vivid and tormenting. It was as if I couldn't stop seeing them, even though I was awake. I couldn't shake the overwhelming, almost paralyzing sense of fear, as if something was watching me in my own home. Huddled in bed, I covered myself, but the image wouldn't leave. At some point during this ordeal, I had a vision, or maybe it was a dream. I saw a young man, his face blurred, but his clothes were from the early 1800s, a simple brownish-beige outfit. He seemed large, not fat, but solidly built. The image of him is still crystal clear in my mind. Somehow, I knew he was one of the people buried in those graves. It was a dreadful experience. The next day, I was still shaken, emotionally disturbed to the point of tears. My parents didn't know what to make of it. Later that day, some odd things happened around the house. My dog was barking at nothing, and our washing machine suddenly malfunctioned and began moving on its own. The repairman said a part inside had loosened, though it had never happened before, and it hasn't happened since. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but it added to the strange feeling that lingered after that night. Eventually, I managed to put the incident out of my mind. It had been disturbing, but I didn't want it affecting my studies, so I moved on. Then, in the spring of 2013, curiosity got the better of me. I wondered who those people in the graves actually were. Perhaps if I found out, it would answer something. So I gathered my courage and returned to the cemetery. I found the graves again and noted down their names. I misplaced the details later, but I remember they were two siblings. A woman named Jane, who died at 28 with 3 children, and her brother, Chatham, who died young, around 21 or 22, in the 1810s. They were the children of a Kentucky senator, who was also buried nearby, and their family home had been close to the cemetery. Learning this, I felt they were just ordinary people, and I thought little more of it. That night, I woke up at exactly 3:30 a.m., unable to sleep. A few moments later, my doorknob wiggled. I froze, staring wide-eyed. My first thought was that it was my cat. She sometimes tries to open doors after sneaking in from the porch. I quietly prayed, "Please, let it just be my cat, so I can get some sleep." Convinced it must have been her, I managed to settle down. The next morning, however, I discovered my cat was on the porch, with the porch door locked. My parents and brother all denied touching my doorknob that night. The following night, I woke again, this time around 3:30 or 4:30. When I'd gone to bed, my brother had been watching TV in the den, just outside my room. Now awake, I could see the light from the den seeping in under my door. Suddenly, my door opened. I heard the doorknob turn, and the door slowly swung halfway open, then began to close again, though it didn't latch shut. I then saw a flash of light in the den, followed by darkness. Assuming it was my brother, I felt strangely calm, thinking he'd just come to check on me. So I got up and closed the door, then tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I asked him about it, but he insisted he'd gone to bed at midnight and had no recollection of getting up. I questioned my family again, but no one admitted to being up at that hour. Uneasy, I became increasingly disturbed by these events. Later that day, while using the computer, I heard my mother screaming my name, as if from outside, as if she needed help. I rushed out, only to find her calmly tending the garden. She looked startled when I came running. "What's wrong?" I asked out of breath. "I heard you calling me." She stared at me, confused, saying she hadn't called my name. She thought I was trying to play a joke on her, but she would never do something like that. Since then, nothing else has happened. I've even returned to the cemetery, but there were no bad feelings. I was about 12 or 13 when I first visited Flint Ridge, a historic home in Logan County, Kentucky, sometime around 2004 or 2005. My family has always been fascinated by old houses, and this visit was meant to be just another casual tour of a property my parents' acquaintances owned. No one was living there, but the house was in the process of being restored for future residents. I didn't know anything about Flint Ridge when we drove up the tree-lined driveway. As we approached, a strange, slightly sick feeling settled in my stomach. The old Federal-style house, dating back to 1803, stood at the end of the drive, with its narrow windows and an expansive lawn stretching before it. It looked peaceful enough, and my family and friends chatted as we explored the yard. It was a very old house. By Logan County standards, one from 1803 is practically ancient. We stepped onto the front porch and someone tried the double doors. They weren't locked, so we walked in, even though the owners weren't expecting us. Inside, the house was breathtaking. A well-preserved treasure from 1803, meticulously restored to its original condition. Despite its charm, an uneasy feeling started to creep over me, growing stronger with each step. We wandered upstairs and came across a strange little room. It was a room within a room with a small door leading to a built-out area. That door was open, but I couldn't bring myself to go in. A powerful feeling of dread washed over me, and I knew I didn't want to be in there. Something felt profoundly wrong. On the way back downstairs with my father, I felt deeply unsettled. I'd mentioned to my mom earlier that I didn't like being there, but everyone else seemed fine. The moment I got back into our van, everything came pouring out. I burst into uncontrollable sobs and started wailing, overwhelmed by an unshakable feeling of darkness. I kept crying out, "That house is evil. Evil is there. A bad house. That house is evil. Darkness lurks there. Demonic. Evil. Evil. Evil." My parents and friends were stunned into silence, not knowing what to say or do. It felt like a wave of despair and anguish had hit me the moment I left the house, mixed with a sickening sense of evil. If evil sounds too vague, it was a sense of immense wickedness, immorality, and wrong. I was sobbing as if I'd witnessed something unspeakably horrible. My mother tried to comfort me, but the tears wouldn't stop. I knew, without a doubt, that there was something dark and sinister in Flint Ridge. Later, we began asking locals about Flint Ridge's history. The house had been built in 1803 by a very wealthy man, wealthy enough that he also owned a townhome, the Washington House, in nearby Russellville. His Flint Ridge plantation was vast, and he owned many slaves. We learned that Flint Ridge was not just a residence. It was a site where slaves were bought and sold. In the course of renovations, the current owners discovered an outbuilding with shackles still attached to the walls. Grim reminders of the cruelty inflicted there. Though I learned all this after my visit, it felt like a dark confirmation of the dread I'd felt in that house. The weight of the torture, suffering, and unimaginable hardships that had taken place there left a mark, one that I had sensed without understanding why. In the years following, I also heard about other people's ghostly encounters at Flint Ridge. One restoration worker described seeing an elderly African-American man on the front lawn. The man, who held a cane, made eye contact with the worker for a solid 2 minutes. But when the worker jumped down from his scaffolding to approach him, the man was gone. Another worker reported seeing an old cane in the very room I couldn't bring myself to enter. That evening, the cane mysteriously disappeared. On a separate occasion, a team of ghost hunters visited Flint Ridge. As they stood outside, after making sure the doors were locked, the front double doors suddenly blew open as if a powerful gust of wind had pushed them. I swear, my experience is real, and I'm convinced that what I felt was the echo of the horrors that took place in that house. The event disturbed me so deeply that I still have nightmares about it, and I hope never to go back to Flint Ridge again. This happened in a tiny town in Kentucky, the kind of place with one stoplight, endless back roads, 2 of them paved, and 4 bars. I was still trying to adjust to life in Kentucky, which is a unique place to be, especially coming from northern Ohio. In this little farm community, everyone worked hard on their land or in a factory, and then partied hard in the evenings. So, when I first encountered the apparition, I assumed he was just another tall, skinny country guy recovering from a wild night out. I was driving down a country road, passing a 3-way intersection with a grassy island in the middle. The spot had been widened by years of farm equipment passing through. As I passed the intersection, another car pulled up to the stop sign, and the driver started honking and calling my name. I slowed down and backed up a bit. I didn't recognize the guy or his car. He was a skinny blonde guy wearing a dark blue t-shirt, flame-patterned sunglasses, and, inexplicably, a yes, like the kind handed out at parties instead of beads. He leaned halfway out of his car window, waving his arm, shouting my name, and insisting he needed to talk to me. I thought about gunning the engine and getting out of there, but he interrupted my thoughts, saying, "No, don't gun your engine. We need to talk. Just pull in here for a minute so we're out of the way. There's a car coming." And, sure enough, there was a car coming down the road, though he wasn't even facing it to see. So, curious, I pulled into the grassy island, our cars side by side with him still on the other side of his car. I got out and called, "Who are you anyway?" as I started walking around his car. But he quickly said, "No, you need to stay right over there and I'll stay right over here. And I'm going to tell you who you are so you know you can trust me." He did, and I was stunned as he proceeded to tell me several things about my life and things that were going to happen in the near future, along with advice on what to do. Every single thing he predicted ended up happening, and while I remembered to do some of what he'd suggested, I couldn't believe how accurate he was. In shock, I began walking around his car again, stammering, "What the F?" It's amazing how, in a moment like that, your vocabulary narrows to the basics. But as soon as I started moving toward him, he said, "Now, I told you you have to stay over there, or I'll have to leave. We can't get any closer than this." I stopped and apologized, and he finished up with a few encouraging words, even threw in a "keep your eye on the sparrow" like in Rocky, climbed back into his car, and drove off. About a year later, while still living there, I was talking to a friend about strange things we'd experienced. I mentioned my encounter, and she looked at me wide-eyed. "Wow, that sounds like the guy that stopped for me. Only my apparition showed up about a month after yours." Her story gave me chills. She'd been alone on a quiet road when her car stalled out, and she couldn't get it to start again. Her gas tank was almost empty, and she was draining her battery trying to start it. Plus, she had her baby in the car. Out of nowhere, A guy with blonde hair and sunglasses appeared at her window, startling her. She started to roll down the window to ask who he was, but he jumped back and told her to stay where she was and popped the hood. He'd get her car started, he said. He opened the hood, told her to try it again, and it started right up. As he walked away, he waved and assured her she'd have enough gas to make it back. Now, this woman knew practically everyone in that county, but she'd never seen him before. A couple of other people also had their own apparition stories. The same blonde guy, wild-looking, showing up at the right moment to help, always staying at least 3 yards away before disappearing. My encounter was especially strange because he knew so many details about me and predicted things that came true. Yet, no one seems to know who he was or what he could have been. The house we raised our kids in was built in 1907, with all the charm and history that comes with a century-old home. It had a certain allure that drew us in immediately, but we quickly realized we weren't alone there. On one of our first nights, we were sitting at the breakfast table when the kids asked why we'd been running up and down the stairs all night. We hadn't been, of course, and my husband and I exchanged glances, sensing we might have an invisible roommate. Over the 7 years we lived there, strange things became part of our lives. I'd had paranormal experiences before, so I wasn't too rattled, and I didn't want to feed into the kids' fears. I brushed it off as old house noises and kept our suspicions quiet. But it didn't take long for my husband and me to get a first-hand encounter with our mysterious roommate. Late one night, after we tucked the kids into bed, we were settling in ourselves when we heard a loud thump just outside our bedroom door in the living room. Thinking it was one of the kids sneaking around, my husband jumped up and opened the door, only to find the house still pitch black and the room empty. He went downstairs to check on the kids, and they were all sound asleep. Another time I had a friend over, and we went into my bedroom to talk. Right away, I noticed the door to the master bath was shut, which was strange because only my husband and I used that bathroom. When I tried to open it, I found it locked. Thinking someone was inside, I called out, but no one answered. Then, I heard what sounded like the shower curtain moving. I went to grab the key, but by the time I came back, the door was slightly open. I swung it wide and said, "Get out of my bathroom," half joking, but I couldn't shake the feeling something had been there. One day, while my husband and I were watching TV, we heard the back door open and slam shut, as though one of the kids had come in. "Don't slam the door," we yelled. When no one answered, my husband went down to check, but no one was there. It was just us in the house. One night, I was lying in bed, unable to sleep while my husband snored beside me. I suddenly felt like we weren't alone in the room. I heard soft shuffling in the carpet, so I tried to nudge my husband awake, but he didn't stir. I turned on my side, pulling the blanket up to my eyes, facing the window that always had a winter draft. I could feel the cold air on my face as the shuffling sounds moved closer. Then, right next to my face, I heard the distinct sound of lips smacking or being licked, followed by a hot breath on my forehead. I held my breath, hoping it would pass. Later, we decided to remodel the downstairs. While my husband was outside fixing a leak, I was doing laundry in the basement, where we told the kids not to go during construction. Each time I came down to switch loads, one of the basement bedroom lights would be on, even though I turned it off repeatedly. Frustrated, I went outside to tell everyone to stay out of the basement, but the kids were playing at the playground, and my husband hadn't been down there. Then there was the time we needed to present certificates for a refinancing course we'd completed. I put them with the rest of our important papers, right where I could see them daily. But when my husband asked for them, they were gone. I searched everywhere, tearing the house apart, but they were nowhere to be found. Eventually, we gave up and ordered a new set. A week later, the new certificates arrived, and I placed them in the same spot. When we needed them again, they were gone just like the first set. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, convinced I'd seen them there. Frustrated, I sat down in the office, ready to give up, when I noticed an envelope poking out from behind a mirror leaning against the wall. I went over, and there they were. The original certificates I'd lost, but the new ones were still missing. Later, I found the second set sitting out in the open on a shelf, as if placed there for me to find. I couldn't help but feel like something was playing tricks on me. These were probably the most memorable moments we had in that house. Nothing too dramatic, but enough to keep us on our toes. Just thought I'd share some of the curious events that came with living in a house with a little extra history. I'm sharing this story with the hope that some of you may offer insight or theories as to what in the world happened. It might not sound scary, but in the moment, it was strange and unnerving. I've shared another incident from this place, and for context, I'll set the scene. When I was 18, I lived with two of my younger brothers in a flat in Boise's historic Warm Springs neighborhood. The house, a relic of another time, was divided into our upstairs apartment and our neighbors downstairs. We were right between a hospital, the old Idaho State Penitentiary, and the old Fort Boise Cemetery, just a few blocks from Boise's historic downtown. With so much history nearby, it wasn't hard to imagine residual energies around. We loved the place, despite its quirks. Our living room was a former upstairs porch, complete with a front door and windows that opened into the main house. It was enclosed with windows along the three outer walls, so we made do with milk crates, a boombox, a hideous pink couch we rescued, and a velvet 1970s thrift store rocker. Some gauzy curtains finished the look, and we considered it quite cozy in a punk sort of way. One warm autumn afternoon, I got home to find my brother's girlfriend, Kay, waiting for him. She was sitting on the couch, so I flopped down in the rocker, kicked off my shoes, and lit a cigarette. It was sunny and hot, and neither of us said much. We didn't know each other well, so we just sat awkwardly, listening to music and waiting for my brothers to return. Tired from my bike ride, I lazily rocked back and forth, pushing the rocker with my feet on the windowsills. Every now and then, as I came around to the back side, I thought I saw a grumpy little face peering in through the sunny upstairs window. I chalked it up to reflections or tricks of the light, but the face kept catching my eye. Finally, I had to stop and look. Floating just outside the window to my left was a small, skinny, wrinkled figure, with a grumpy old face and a ruffled nightcap, like something out of Little House on the Prairie. It was very small, maybe only 2 feet tall, and it glided with its arms drawn up stiffly, little fists clenched at chest level. Its lower half trailed off in a sort of wispy cloud. It didn't look at me, just stared ahead with an unhappy expression. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Goosebumps prickled my skin despite the sun. Turning away, I hoped it hadn't seen me, as though I could somehow escape its notice. Trying to dismiss it as a product of my imagination, I stayed quiet, not wanting to make things more awkward with Kay. Then, out of nowhere, Kay said, "Did you just see that banshee behind you in the window?" My heart skipped a beat. She described seeing the exact same thing. A grumpy, ghostly figure, similar to the banshee in Darby Ogill. She had been watching it float just behind me. We both started freaking out, describing our shared vision of this little figure in complete disbelief. Kay was in tears, and we bolted downstairs to wait outside until my brothers came home. Kay was so shaken that one of our friends, an army medic, treated her for shock. Neither of us had the sight or any previous paranormal sensitivity, but Kay was young and troubled at the time, and I've since learned that this can sometimes attract strange energy. Other weird, unrelated things happened in that house too. Long after we moved out, my brothers told me they'd often heard footsteps in the empty kitchen, and, in our neighbor's place downstairs, they'd occasionally hear sounds of laughter or party music. The building had been a brothel long ago. I don't know if what Kay and I saw was a banshee, but it didn't seem to be trying to get in or even acknowledge us. And being so small, it didn't seem like it was ever a full-sized person. I've wondered ever since what we saw, whether it was a ghost or something else entirely. Whatever it was, I can't explain why we both saw the same thing that warm autumn afternoon, peering in through the windows of our odd little living room. Let me start with a little background. The year was 1996, and I was pregnant with my first child. My ex-husband and I had been living with his parents for far too long, and with a baby on the way, we knew we needed a place of our own. Given our limited income, finding something affordable seemed almost impossible. Then we learned about an old house that had once belonged to my ex's grandmother, sitting empty since the incident. As the story went, my ex's grandma, uncle, and aunt had moved into the house in the 1950s after the state bought their rural property to build the interstate. Soon after they settled in, my ex's aunt, Eileen, was attacked and assaulted by 3 men in the alley behind the house. This tragedy shattered her, and she was eventually committed to a state asylum, where she took her own life shortly after. The house was later left to my ex's grandmother, but after a bad fall down the front steps, she was also admitted to a nursing home, where she passed away. The only one left was the uncle, who already struggled with his mental health. Overwhelmed, he attempted suicide in the house. He survived but was also institutionalized, leaving the house empty and locked up for years. When my ex and I reached out to the uncle about moving in, he seemed thrilled, almost eager to have someone living there again. I was aware of the house's tragic history, but given my own experiences with the paranormal, it didn't deter me. We needed a place for our growing family, and I believed that maybe the presence of a new family, and especially a baby, would bring new life into the house. At the time, my ex worked the night shift, so I took on the task of getting the house ready. I decided to go over one night to paint, thinking I could make some progress before the big move. But as soon as I pulled up, I felt a strange, unwelcoming energy. Determined not to let it sway me, I grabbed my supplies and went inside. The atmosphere inside the house was heavy, almost oppressive, but I pushed through, telling myself it was just nerves. I started painting the living room, trying to ignore the odd noises that seemed to come from different parts of the house. Then came the hissing sounds and faint voices, making me feel uneasy. At one point, I heard what sounded like a metal chair in the bathroom being abruptly moved, followed by the bathroom door shutting. Frozen in place with the paint roller in my hand, I tried not to look away from the wall, afraid of what I might see. I sensed a presence close to me, and suddenly, right by my ear, I heard a whisper, "Donnell." It knew my name. That was enough. I dropped the roller, leaving the lights on, the doors unlocked, and the radio playing as I rushed out. You'd think that would have been enough to make me change my mind, but between my in-laws' less-than-ideal living arrangement and the arrival of our first child, I decided we'd go through with it. I didn't tell my ex about what had happened, chalking it up to pregnancy exhaustion to avoid painting at night. Once we moved in, we stayed there for 3 years, and while we had several strange occurrences, they were manageable. One evening, while my husband was working, I was home alone and heavily pregnant. Suddenly, I heard voices coming from the basement. It sounded like a poorly tuned radio, just faint talking and then silence. Unnerved, I went to the basement door and locked it, deciding it would stay locked from then on. I continued to hear those faint voices, but I never mentioned it to my ex. Another morning, I noticed faint handprints on the ceiling above our bed. The ceilings were high, so it was odd, but I shrugged it off. Yet each time I looked up, there seemed to be more handprints, slowly multiplying over time. Once, as we headed to bed, the television turned on by itself. We exchanged glances, and my ex simply walked over and shut it off. Another night, I was jolted awake by loud yelling coming from the living room. It turned out the television had once again turned itself on, and the volume seemed to be at maximum. One thing that particularly troubled me was a large stain in the dining room. No matter how many times I cleaned it, or even hired professionals, it would always reappear. When I asked the uncle where he'd tried to take his life, he pointed to the dining room. After that, I threw a rug over the stain and left it alone. For the most part, we managed to live peacefully enough with these small disturbances. Then, not long after our first child was born, the uncle called in the middle of the night, desperate to leave the nursing home. So he came to stay with us in his old house. Once he moved in, the paranormal activity seemed to stop. When I became pregnant with our second child, things took a darker turn. One winter day, when I was about 7 months along, I slipped on the icy front steps. I'd asked my ex several times to salt the steps, but it hadn't been done. Trying to protect my stomach, I grabbed the rail and twisted to land on my back. These were the same steps where his grandmother had fallen and ultimately passed away from her injuries. I was rushed to the hospital, and though both the baby and I were cleared, the remainder of my pregnancy was difficult, resulting in an emergency C-section. 2 months after our second child was born, the uncle suddenly kicked us out. We moved, leaving the house and its mysteries behind. But not long after, I began to feel sick. I couldn't keep food down and nothing seemed to help. For nearly 2 years, I went from doctor to doctor, specialist to specialist, trying to find answers. Eventually, the cause was discovered. During my fall, the impact had jammed the baby's body against my spleen, crushing it against my pancreas and spine. My spleen died, 60% of my pancreas was destroyed, and my spine was severely damaged. Since that fall, my life has been one of surgeries and chronic pain. Looking back, I sometimes wish we'd stayed at my in-laws' house, as difficult as it was. At least then, I might still have my health. The house gave us a roof over our heads, but it took so much more in return. Let me paint a picture of the house where time seemed frozen, as though it had been untouched for decades. It was 2005 when we found this charming old house in the historic part of downtown Pocatello, Idaho. I was immediately drawn to it for its classic 1940s to 1950s feel. It had all the original carpet and wallpaper from that time, and even the old stove was still there, though its small oven space proved inconvenient when it came to baking. As I explored each room, I noticed that inside one closet door hung an album insert of Perry Como, something you might imagine a teenage girl in the 1950s would have kept in her bedroom. It looked like it had been there for decades, just left as a small memento of another time. Curious about the home's story, I asked the realtor why it felt as though no one had lived in it since the 1950s. The realtor explained that an elderly woman had lived there since the 1940s, raising her daughter in the house, and had only passed away the year before. The place intrigued me even more, and I fell in love with its vintage charm. We moved in right away, and I decided to keep Perry Como's picture right where it was in my bedroom. But almost immediately, problems with the house began. First, the bathroom flooded, then the kitchen and the toilet stopped working. It felt like every time a plumber fixed one thing, something else would go wrong. Eventually, even the stove stopped working. On one of our first nights there, I was lying in bed late at night, with the television on in the background, just starting to nod off. Suddenly, a loud, heavy slam echoed from the foot of my bed, jolting me wide awake. I couldn't see what had caused it, but I had the unsettling feeling that someone didn't approve of me falling asleep with the TV on. After that night, I always made sure to turn off the television before drifting off. Between my bedroom and the kids' rooms, there was a small hallway where I placed a little lamp on a table to help them navigate in the dark if they got up. Occasionally, I would hear footsteps outside my door in that hallway and assumed it was one of my boys getting up to use the bathroom. But each time when I went to check, they were sound asleep. My door had a gap at the bottom and a skeleton keyhole, which allowed me to see a shadow moving in the hallway, yet no one was there when I looked. I had set up a little painting nook in the unfinished basement, but every time I went down there, I felt like I wasn't alone. The sensation was so unsettling that I eventually stopped going down there altogether. Strangely, I began to feel constantly ill, as though I had the flu. Yet whenever I left the house for a while, I'd start to feel better. I also noticed my ex-husband and I would argue constantly, and I couldn't understand why. We seemed to be angry with each other for no reason at all. After only 3 months, we decided to move out. Looking back, I strongly feel that the elderly woman's spirit remained in the house. It seemed like she was firmly set in her ways and wasn't particularly welcoming to outsiders. This story comes from our current home, which we purchased in September 2020. Built in the early 1990s, the house has had some remodeling done. The newer wood-look flooring looks nice, but because it was installed poorly, it snaps and cracks all day and night. In those first weeks, the floor noises kept both me and our Yorkie up, especially since my head rests just a couple of feet from the bedroom doorway, where the wood floors end and the carpet begins. I'd get up, check around, but soon realized it was just the house settling. In November 2020, I just discovered the YGS site, and one early morning, I was typing up one of my visitation stories. My back was to the dining room and kitchen, and I heard an odd noise coming from the kitchen behind me. Curious and a little on edge, I moved to the other side of the couch where I could see the kitchen entry. My wife had been wary about me delving back into past experiences, especially with a new grandbaby on the way, hoping I wouldn't bring anything home with all this reminiscing. That morning, I heard what I thought was metal clinking in the kitchen. I walked over, following the sound to the sink, where I found nothing unusual. The next day, though, I looked under the sink and discovered mouse droppings and 2 small holes in the cabinet floor. Armed with snap traps from our old house, I managed to catch 2 mice in the first week, then filled the holes with steel wool. Problem solved, or so I thought. A few weeks later, I was lying awake early one morning when I heard a strange noise echoing along the wood floors. Sneaking out of bed, I followed the sound to the kitchen. The noise was coming from under the sink, and I realized it was a mouse trying to chew its way back through the cabinet floor. I opened the cabinet door, shouted a few choice words, and slammed it shut. The chewing stopped. The next day, I reset the trap and caught the little guy, then replaced the steel wool. Then, sometime after Thanksgiving, I had an experience that took me completely by surprise. It was a beautiful morning around 10:30 a.m., and I was cleaning up in the kitchen after making breakfast. With the back walls drapes open, sunlight sparkled across our floors. I was standing in the spot where our fridge would go. Our neighbors had lent us an old fridge in the garage until ours arrived, holding food in both hands to take out to the fridge. I heard my wife's footsteps coming around the corner, so I looked down, expecting to see her reflection or her feet to avoid bumping into her. Instead, about 4 feet in front of me, I saw something extraordinary. A black, V-shaped shadow appeared, like an arrowhead, about a half-inch thick and an inch and a half tall. It seemed to billow slightly, with a hopping movement as it came closer, like it was alive. Mesmerized, I watched as it got within a foot of me, and then I saw a tiny mouse at the point of the V. This little black mouse seemed to be pushing the shadow in front of it, with the V shape curving over its head, cheeks, front legs, and back legs, almost like a protective shield. I could see its tiny shoulders and hips moving, and its long tail swishing side to side. After about 4 seconds, it ran right to my feet and disappeared. Just then, my wife came around the corner, and I asked, "Did you just see that?" She hadn't been looking down, so she missed it. I told her I thought she'd spooked the little guy into running across the floor. It was an amazing sight, a spirit mouse with a shadowy shield around it. After that encounter, I switched to live traps and started relocating the mice to a nearby park. In late December, my wife mentioned she'd found signs of mice in the cabinet with the Lazy Susan. A mouse had chewed into a bag of rice at the back, so we tossed the rice, cleaned the cabinet with bleach, and discovered an old set of salt and pepper shakers we hadn't seen in years. Mice figurines dressed in old-fashioned hats and clothing. We put them back on the counter as a reminder of our little visitors. Since then, we haven't had any more mouse sightings, though I find myself constantly glancing at the floor. Oddly enough, most of my unusual sightings happen right after breakfast, when I'm fat and happy. When I was very young, living in my old house in Hardmoney, I had my very first paranormal experience. Since I was under the age of 10, I didn't fully understand what was happening, only that it didn't seem like something that should be happening. Let me share a little background about the house. It was a white Victorian built in the late 1800s by a preacher as the parsonage for a nearby church. The basement even had some old cannonballs, I believe. After the preacher passed away, the house stopped serving as the parsonage. But I don't think he died there. Other than that, I don't know much about its former residents or about the people who sold it to my parents. Structurally, it had only seen minor changes until my parents bought it around 20 years ago. When my mom and dad got married, they lived in a trailer until I was born, which was about 17 years into their marriage. My mom has told me that as soon as they started remodeling the Hardmoney house, she found out she was pregnant with me, her miracle baby, since she'd been told she couldn't have children. To add to the wonder of it, I was born on my dad's birthday. Other than some dreams my mom had about a future me before I was born, everything was normal. My parents only added rooms in the gables and filled in a small hallway to make space for a staircase, so nothing extreme was done to the house. As a little girl, I would sleep with my mom every night, and the night my experience happened was no different. I was fast asleep until I woke up in the middle of the night, either to roll over or go to the bathroom. When I opened my eyes, I saw a giant white light drifting into the room from the window near the foot of the bed. The bed was against the back wall with the window on the right side. It was a queen-sized bed, if that gives a sense of scale. I remember staring at this huge, glowing white circle, which was slowly floating into the room. All I could think was, pretend to be asleep and it won't notice you. Just go back to sleep. I forced my eyes closed, hoping it would leave me alone. The next morning, I told my mom about it, but she mostly brushed it off. Over the years, she would suggest it might have been lights from our neighbors, but that didn't make sense. It was the middle of the night, and the light was coming from only one window, filling the room with an intense glow. It was as bright as a fluorescent light, yet somehow it didn't light up the entire room. To give a sense of scale, the light was about as large as the window, which ran nearly from the floor to the ceiling in that room with an 8-foot ceiling height. Looking back, it must have been around 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide from my perspective. That image has stayed with me all these years, as vivid as ever. I've wondered so many things about that night. Why was it there? Why was it so large? Did it wake me up? Was this a regular occurrence and I just happened to see it that one time? For the remaining years we lived there, I never saw it again. I don't recall any other experiences like it, nor anything unusual that hinted at a repeat event. We moved out when I was about 12, so I lived in that house for about 5 years after seeing the giant, glowing light and never saw it again. Now that I'm older, I've watched shows and read about paranormal phenomena, and part of me wonders if it was some kind of orb. But another part of me says it couldn't have been an orb, it was just too large and moved too slowly. I always loved that house and took care to treat it with respect, but I could never shake the feeling that something was just a little off. Nothing felt outright bad, but there was a subtle sense of unease in certain parts of the house. I know that one day, when I move out and live on my own, I'll probably return to the hard money house. It still feels like my real home, and I'm always ready to go back. When I was in 4th grade, I had a strange experience that still haunts me 14 years later. Even now, I'm unsure what to make of it, but I know it frightened me then, and the memory is still vivid. I lived with my grandma growing up, and we shared a bed most nights. Often, it was just the two of us in the house, though occasionally other grandchildren, who were adults by then, would stay until they found a place of their own. The house was built in the late 1800s, though I don't know the exact date or much about the original owners. My grandma grew up there and inherited it after her mother passed away. It was an old, cozy house with a lot of history. Growing up, I loved reading, especially Goosebumps by R.L. Stine, and I'd regularly check them out from the school library. My grandma encouraged me to read, and I was fascinated by stories of ghosts and spirits. But I also scared easily, especially with scary movies, books, and stories. One night, I was reading The Haunted Jack-o'-lantern and had just finished it. At the end of each Goosebumps book, there's a preview of another story, and this one was about a ghost boy. I started reading it, but as sometimes happened when I was young, I spooked myself for no particular reason. I decided to go to bed, where I joined my grandma as usual. I fell asleep quickly but woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. I sat up in bed, though I don't know why, and as I looked around, I saw a girl who looked exactly like me sitting at my grandma's vanity. At the time, I shared the vanity with her. The girl had her hair pulled back in a ponytail, exactly like mine, same length, same position, and she was fluffing a bunch of artificial flowers my grandma kept on the vanity. I sat there, staring at this girl who looked just like me, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was dark, but the streetlights outside cast a dim glow through the curtains, and I could see her clearly. I was frozen, watching her, until fear washed over me as I realized what I was looking at. I reached for my sleeping grandma and hid under the blankets, as scared kids do, and eventually, I must have fallen back asleep. The next morning, I remembered the experience clearly. I was still so shaken that I ran out of the room even though it was broad daylight. I was so scared by what I'd seen that I stopped reading Goosebumps altogether. I still don't know if reading about the ghost in the story had anything to do with it. I was always a fan of those books, and nothing like this had ever happened before. I don't know of anyone in my family who looks just like me, so it couldn't have been an ancestor or anything like that. Now that I'm older, I can still picture that night as if it just happened, but I have no answers. Part of me wanted to call out to the figure, but I was terrified that she'd slowly turn her head toward me, and I definitely didn't want to see that. It couldn't have been my reflection either, since the bed was positioned against the wall, nowhere near the window, and I wasn't close enough to cast a shadow on the vanity. Besides, even if it was a reflection, how could I explain seeing her fluff the flowers on the vanity? I don't know why I saw her, what it meant, or even if I was fully awake. But I remember it all so clearly that I believe it was real. I haven't had any more incidents like it, so maybe it was a one-time thing. I've had realistic, scary dreams before, but this felt entirely different. If anyone has insights, I'd appreciate it. I've never found any answers, and I still wonder why it happened. It was just me, my grandma, and the dog in the house that night, and even the dog didn't react. I know it didn't feel like a dream, and I still don't have an explanation for what I saw. What I'm about to share is a collection of events that happened to my family and me from the mid-80s to early 2000s. We lived in a rural area of Kentucky, in a small trailer on an old, retired farm. My family was large, 10 kids in all, with my 6 full siblings and I being homeschooled. Our nearest neighbors were several acres away down an unpaved, one-lane road. On the property stood my father's childhood home, an old 2-story farmhouse with a basement. Although it was still standing, my father refused to live in it, never explaining why. Instead, it became a storage area, only occasionally used for activities when we didn't have enough space in the trailer. Here's a brief layout of the farmhouse for context. The most used back door led into the kitchen, with a swinging door ahead to the dining room and a doorway to the right leading into a hallway. Down that hall was the master bedroom, a door to the basement, and, at the end, the living room which looped back to the dining room. A staircase in the living room led to the second floor, where there were 3 rooms, a small one at the top of the stairs, 2 larger bedrooms to the left and right, and an attic past the left-hand bedroom. The basement was a single open space with a coal room beneath the front porch. The entire house was packed with clutter, old furniture, boxes of books, magazines, and knickknacks, creating narrow paths between piles. Footsteps. One of the earliest incidents, which I've heard many times, involved strange footsteps. We used the master bedroom downstairs as a classroom since it wasn't as cluttered as the rest of the house. During one quiet study session, the family heard heavy footsteps ascending the staircase on the other side of the wall. The footsteps then echoed from the left-hand bedroom above, followed by a sound like boots being kicked off. Then silence. My oldest brother turned to our mom and said, "I told you." He had heard these same sounds before while studying alone in the house, but our parents hadn't believed him. Perfume and the man. My oldest sister would often go to the farmhouse alone to practice piano. Sometimes, while playing, she would wish that our deceased grandmother, who had lived there until her passing, could hear her. Right after, she'd catch the scent of our grandmother's perfume, even though none of her perfume bottles were left in the house. After it happened a few times, my sister grew uneasy and started bringing me along, as I was only 3 or 4 years old. She later told me about one particular day when I wandered toward the stairs. She followed and found me halfway up, asking playfully, "Where do you think you're going?" I pointed to the top of the stairs and replied, "The man told me to go there." She picked me up and quickly took me out of the house. Mimic. The next series of events happened sometime before the perfume and the man incidents. My father would often go to the farmhouse to escape the noise of our crowded trailer. On 2 occasions, 2 of my older sisters went to the house to fetch groceries and knocked on the back door, waiting for our father to let them in. Both times, a voice that sounded just like our father answered and footsteps approached the door. But just as the steps got close, another sibling would yell from across the yard, "Daddy's not over there." Neither sister waited to see who or what was at the door. Mr. Blue. Years later, my sister, who was just older than me, went into the farmhouse to retrieve something for my father, who was outside Target practicing with friends. She was in the kitchen facing the hallway when she saw a young man with blonde hair in a blue t-shirt and khaki pants walking from the master bedroom and heading down the hall toward the living room. She assumed he was one of Dad's friends and didn't think much of it. but when she mentioned it to my father, he told her no one else was inside. From then on, we nicknamed this figure Mr. Blue. Scraping chair. When I was about 10, my mom sent me to the farmhouse to get flour for a dessert she was making. By then, I'd heard these stories all my life, so going in alone always made me nervous. As I rushed to grab the bag of flour from the pantry on the left side of the kitchen, a loud scraping sound started directly above me. It sounded just like a chair being pushed back from a table but dragged out for several seconds. The sound came from the small room above the kitchen, which was filled with junk and no furniture. I didn't investigate. I knew I was the only one with a key. I left immediately, shaken. Screaming cat. After the chair incident, I started taking one of our cats with me when I had to go to the farmhouse. Sometimes the cats would wander around, and other times they'd refuse to enter at all. Once, I brought an adventurous cat with me, and he went all the way upstairs. Moments later, I heard boxes crashing and the cat began to yowl in distress. Too scared to investigate alone, I ran back to the trailer and convinced my father to go with me. When we returned, the cat was calmly sitting on the kitchen counter, cleaning himself, showing no sign of fear. We checked upstairs but found nothing out of place. My father didn't believe I'd heard anything at all. These experiences were just some of the strange events that happened in the farmhouse. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered there. Each incident felt separate yet connected to the eerie energy that seemed to permeate the house. In August 1983, my husband, our 2-year-old son, and I went to visit my aunt for a week. My aunt and uncle lived on a large farm in a tiny town called Cold Springs, Kentucky. The nearest actual town was Alexandria, and the closest neighbor was a good 10 miles down the pike. Their home was a relatively modern, one-story ranch with an apartment attached at the back. My uncle's father had lived in that apartment until he passed away in 1980. The house, likely built in the 60s or 70s, stood in stark contrast to the old barns and sheds scattered across the property, which had been in my uncle's family for generations. We stayed in the apartment, and my aunt and I agreed not to tell my husband that my uncle's dad had passed away in the bed we were sleeping in. He spooked easily. Country folk tend to be early risers, and naturally they turn in early too. So, before long, it was just my aunt and me, catching up on family news over a game of Scrabble, her favorite. The conversation eventually turned to the paranormal. My mom had once told her that I had a gift for sensing things. I braced myself, expecting a lecture like my father would give, with his Bible-thumping sermons about Satan's influence. But my aunt surprised me, saying gently, "Believe me or not, but odd things happen around here." She explained that the door knocker on their front door would sometimes rap by itself. Almost on cue, we heard the shave and a haircut knock pattern. I turned to the door wide-eyed and my aunt said, "You can look, but nobody will be there." Sure enough, I checked, and no one was outside. The knocker was shielded by a heavy, latched storm door, and it was so solid that no wind or vibration could have moved it, especially in that distinct rhythm. I shrugged, saying, "Well, you didn't imagine that." My aunt went on to say that the door knocker often served as a warning. Once, it woke her from a deep sleep, and she discovered a kitchen curtain had blown onto an active stove burner and caught fire. Another time, the knocking roused them just in time to catch strange men trying to break into their barn. I told her it sounded like a blessing, and that someone or something was protecting them. She shared more stories. One morning, she and my uncle both heard the unmistakable sound of a freight train coming through the kitchen. There weren't any train tracks anywhere nearby, not even old, abandoned ones, and the noise terrified her. My uncle worked as a boilermaker in Indiana, where he had to cross several sets of tracks. She begged him to stay home, thinking the sound might be a warning, but he shrugged it off as strange thunder and left. 3 times that morning, the sound of the train grew louder, with the distinct whistle of a freight train. As he neared the Indiana-Kentucky border, his truck suddenly died on the tracks, refusing to restart. Several cars drove around him while he checked under the hood, and then a train whistle sounded as a freight train barreled around the bend. The crossing gates and signals had failed, and the train barely missed the car in front of him. When he tried the ignition one last time, the truck started right up. My aunt also mentioned something she called the whistler. I experienced this firsthand. Each day, we'd hear what sounded like a tin penny whistle warming up with scales, then launching into an old tune. We couldn't locate the source. It seemed to move, sometimes sounding like it was near the barn, other times outside the house. It would play every morning at dawn and every evening just after twilight. My uncle insisted it was a barn owl. I thought, really? An owl that hoots in melody? One morning, I woke up early, eager to explore the property in the peaceful stillness of a country dawn. It was a misty morning, and the dew sparkled like tiny diamonds. Plucking a blade of grass, I whistled through it softly. A moment later, a few notes drifted back toward me. I turned to see a small boy, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on the top railing of the sow's pen. He was dressed plainly, wearing knickers, and gave me a soft smile. I greeted him with a gentle, hello. But before I could take another step, he vanished, gone in an instant. When I told my aunt about him, she nodded, a little sadly, and said, I had a feeling it was a child. A few days after I returned home, my aunt called, asking if I'd had any visitors. She hadn't heard the whistler since I'd left. In 1987, both my mom and my aunt had passed. My mom in '86 and my aunt in '87. While straightening up my closet one day, I came across our Scrabble game and, feeling nostalgic, took it to the table, thinking of how my mom and aunt had loved playing together. I imagined them somewhere, playing endless rounds together now, and I smiled at the thought. My daughter toddled up, and as I lifted her, I told her how much they would have adored her and spoiled her. Out of curiosity, I drew 7 Scrabble tiles, just to see what word or words I could form. As I turned them over one by one, the letters read, in perfect order, LOVEYOU. In that moment, I knew beyond any doubt that they were still with me, in their own way, sending love from wherever they were. After going through several difficult situations in a particular region of the U.S., I decided to take my 2 children and move to a more rural, peaceful place. When I told them we'd be moving to Kentucky, I showed them pictures of deer, snow, large fields, and farms. They were thrilled. Their excitement was contagious, and I couldn't wait to start fresh. Within a couple of months, we had settled into our new apartment in Kentucky. We took evening walks along nearby trails, enjoying the sight of wild deer around the complex and the long-awaited snowfall. But our excitement was short-lived. After about a month, COVID hit hard, and the governor of Kentucky shut down all brick-and-mortar schools, switching to online learning. I found myself suddenly out of work. Though I felt disheartened, I tried to keep a positive outlook for my kids. I kept our routines intact, sticking to our usual morning and evening rituals, though we were home all day now. That's when I began to notice small, unsettling things. At first, I thought it was just my children being a little mischievous. One afternoon, after preparing lunch and washing the dishes, I went to serve my kids, who were busy with schoolwork in the living room. Afterward, I quickly used the restroom, just a few steps away. When I returned to the kitchen for a glass of tea, I saw that all the plates in the dish drainer had been turned around, facing the opposite direction. I froze. I asked my children why they'd gone into the kitchen, reminding them to stay focused on their studies. Both looked at me, confused, and said they hadn't been near the kitchen. I dismissed their answers, asking them not to touch the dishes again, but they insisted they hadn't moved anything. Almost ready to scold them, I took a deep breath and let it go. We went back to our work as usual. Then, another strange incident occurred. I noticed that the screens in the back windows had been pushed out. I called the kids over and asked them who had opened the windows, showing them how the screens were pushed outward. Both denied it. Normally, they would blame each other if one of them was at fault, but this time they both looked genuinely confused. I felt something strange, like there was more going on than met the eye. 35 days into our new life, things took a turn. That night, as we were settling into sleep, my children woke up and asked if they could sleep with me. Trying to help them fall back asleep, I suggested we all camp out in the living room. I turned on the TV and we each found a place on the couches, my daughter and I on one couch and my son on another, facing us. After a while, we all drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly, feeling wide awake as though I'd had a full night's rest. The faint light coming through the blinds cast a dim glow in the room. As I scanned my surroundings, I noticed my son on the opposite couch, but something was wrong. He appeared to be moving slowly toward the left side of the couch. But it wasn't like he was moving himself. He wasn't shifting or adjusting in his sleep. It looked as if something was lifting him by his armpits, dragging him to the side of the couch. I squinted, trying to focus, and in that moment, my heart started pounding. There was no shape, no form, just this invisible force lifting him. I rubbed my eyes, hoping it was a trick of my imagination. But when I looked again, I saw him drop back onto the couch, falling a good 6 inches. I was stunned, frozen for a second before I leapt up and switched on the lights. I hurriedly turned on every light in the apartment, waking both kids. Trying to stay calm, I didn't tell them what I had seen. Instead, I told them it was an early start to the day and suggested we go for a sunrise walk. They were confused, but an hour later, we found ourselves out for an early morning walk, trying to shake off the eeriness of the night. That day, I tried to go about our usual routine, but my mind kept drifting back to what I had seen. When evening came, I felt a strange urge to have us sleep in the living room again. Maybe I thought it'd be safer closer to the front door. I moved my son's couch closer to mine and left the TV on. My daughter and I stayed up watching TV until my son fell asleep. Half an hour later, my daughter asked to watch one more episode, and I agreed. That's when my son suddenly started shaking. Not a mild shiver, but a violent shake. His arms and legs jerking uncontrollably. My daughter and I shot up, paralyzed by shock for a moment. As his mother, instinct took over and I moved toward him. Just as I touched his shoulder, he stopped shaking. His eyes fluttered open, looking at me sleepily. "Hi, Mom," he said, as if he'd just woken from a deep sleep. I pulled his blanket up over him, unsure of what to make of what I'd just witnessed. But no sooner had I sat back down when I saw his blanket begin to shake violently. My son lay still, yet the blanket looked as if something was grabbing it, lifting and shaking it. I gasped, turning to my daughter, who whispered, "Mom, do you see that?" We sat in shock, unable to move as we watched the blanket rise. I approached my son again, but just as I was about to touch the blanket, it shot up into the air, lifted by an invisible force. My daughter started screaming, and I quickly reached out to my son, who jumped over to our couch as if he'd sensed the danger. I turned on every light once more, but nothing could shake the fear that had gripped us. That night, as we hurriedly packed a few bags, other strange occurrences continued, though none were as terrifying as the blanket incident. We left with just our clothes and a few essentials, and we never looked back. I didn't want anything from that apartment, not a single item to remind us of those nights. Our move to Kentucky was supposed to be a fresh start, a new chapter, but something there had other plans. Since that night, we've never seen anything like that again. And thanks to God, we haven't had to. Some places just aren't meant to be lived in, and we were grateful to leave that one behind. When I was 20, I moved into my first apartment in an older home in the Highlands area of Louisville. It was a beautiful place with charm and character, and the rent was surprisingly affordable for the area. During the initial walkthrough, I did get a faint feeling of a presence, but I brushed it off, too excited about moving in to dwell on it. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. One evening, my roommate and I were relaxing in the living room, chatting and laughing, when out of nowhere, a picture frame and some books flew off the built-in bookshelf beside us. It wasn't like they just fell. They were pushed. These were deep shelves, and if the items had merely tipped, they would have stayed within the shelf. My roommate and I stared at each other, stunned and trying to make sense of what had happened. But we both knew that for them to fly out the way they did, something, or someone, had to have pushed them. Not long after that, I experienced something even more chilling. I was in the shower one evening when I saw a tall, dark figure walk past the shower door. I assumed it was my roommate, as he was tall and often wore dark clothes. I called out to him, but there was no response. I figured he hadn't heard me, so I got out, wrapped myself in a towel, and walked over to the vanity area, calling out again, "Hello? Did you hear me?" There was no one there. My heart pounded as I checked the adjoining closet, hoping to find him there, but it was empty. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I immediately called my roommate, asking if he'd been home. His answer chilled me even more. "I've been at work all day. I won't be home until tonight." I hurriedly dressed, left the apartment, and asked him to call me when he got home because I didn't want to be there alone. A few weeks passed, and just when I started to think things had quieted down, something else happened. I was lying in bed one morning, slowly waking up, when suddenly, my bedroom door slammed shut with such force that I froze in shock. At first, I thought my roommate must have been playing a prank, or maybe a friend had stayed over and decided to have some fun. I went straight to his room, but it was empty. I checked every room in the house, but I was alone. My roommate's car wasn't even in the driveway. I called him immediately, asking if he'd been home, and slammed my door. He replied that he'd stayed over at a friend's after work. Fear took over, and I grabbed my keys, ran out of the apartment in my pajamas, and drove straight to my college campus, where I spent the day in the library, waiting until my roommate was home. By this point, both my roommate and I were getting unnerved, so we started sleeping downstairs in the living room, and neither of us wanted to be alone in the apartment. Desperate for answers, we decided to talk to the landlord, asking if previous tenants had experienced anything similar. She was strangely evasive, giving us short answers and avoiding eye contact. It was clear she didn't want to discuss it. Feeling unsettled, we reached out to the Kentucky Ghost Hunters Society. We told them only that we'd been experiencing activity, hoping for some validation or insight. They sent a team of paranormal investigators and a medium to check the place out. As soon as the medium climbed the stairs and approached my bedroom, they stopped and said, "There's a dark figure standing in the doorway of that room. This is not a good spirit." Hearing those words, I felt overwhelmed and decided to leave the apartment while they continued. The medium went on to say they sensed the spirit of a child, around 5 years old, and a man who wasn't threatening, but rather seemed to walk in circles around my roommate's room. They explained that if we were experiencing small mischievous things, like items falling or moving, it was likely the child's spirit causing it. My roommate and I exchanged glances, recalling the picture frame and books that had flown off the shelf. But the spirit in my room was their main concern. They warned us it might be something darker, possibly even demonic, and it didn't want to leave. I made up my mind then and there. I needed to move out. While packing up my things, I turned to set a box in the hallway, and as I did, I walked through a misty, white cloud that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. It reminded me of chalk dust hanging in the air, as if someone had just clapped chalkboard erasers. I didn't feel threatened by it, just bewildered by the strangeness of it all. On my last day in the apartment, my mom came over to help me clean. As the day wore on, she insisted I go back to her house to get a good night's sleep for an upcoming test. She said she would finish mopping the stairs and lock up. Not long after I left, she showed up at my parents' home, visibly shaken. Her face was pale, and she looked genuinely scared. When I asked what had happened, she explained that she'd heard heavy footsteps pacing back and forth in the bedroom above her while she was mopping the stairs. She knew my roommate had already moved out and that she was alone in the apartment, so she'd left as quickly as she could. She looked at me and said, "I don't know how you lived there. It's been 12 years since that experience, but I still get chills whenever I talk about that apartment. The memories linger, and sometimes I wonder who or what was really there with us." I live on the outskirts of a small historic town called Vine Grove, well off the beaten path. The area is secluded, surrounded by dense forests, and close to Otter Creek. For 9 years, I'd lived here with my chocolate lab and bull mastiff mix, Harley. Harley was my loyal companion, my best friend, and losing him last year was heartbreaking. He'd grown old, losing his hearing, his vision fading, and his hips starting to fail. I knew it was the kindest thing, but that didn't make it any easier to say goodbye. I hadn't had any paranormal encounters since I was a kid, back when my family lived on a haunted farm. That's a story for another time, though. Fast forward to November 2012, the night everything changed. Back then, I was living alone, just me and Harley for company. One night, I was lying on the couch watching a movie I'd been wanting to see. Harley was asleep nearby in his doggy bed, positioned right next to the TV. It was a little after midnight when I noticed Harley was becoming restless. He started to whimper, something he rarely did, and began pacing around the room. After his second lap around the room, Harley stopped near the door and fixed his gaze down the hallway. At first, I thought nothing of it since he'd already been out for the night. I went back to my movie, but when he didn't move after a few minutes, I felt a twinge of unease. His gaze was unwavering, locked onto the dark hallway, and he was completely still, as if transfixed by something I couldn't see. Trying to lighten the mood, I asked, "See a mouse or something, buddy?" But he didn't budge, his focus entirely on the hallway. That's when I felt it too. An odd, chilling sensation, like we weren't alone in the house. Slowly, I got up and walked over behind Harley, peering down the hall toward the open door of the bedroom at the far end. The darkness in that room felt unusually heavy, as if it absorbed any light trying to reach it. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, when suddenly, Harley let out a low, menacing growl. It wasn't his usual grumble. This was deep, serious, the kind of growl a dog makes when he's on high alert. My stomach tightened. I looked down at him, noticing his hackles were raised, his body tense. My mind raced, and then I thought I saw a dark figure shift within the shadows of the bedroom doorway. I froze, the words forming in my head. "There's someone in the house." I took a cautious step forward, intending to flip on the hall light, but Harley pushed against me, refusing to let me pass. He was determined to stay between me and whatever was lurking down that hall. Then, just like that, it was over. Harley let out one last whimper, then turned and padded back to his bed, lying down as if nothing had happened. My heart was still pounding, but I knew I couldn't just leave it at that. Grabbing a bat from behind the couch, I turned on the hall light and walked cautiously toward the bedroom. I reached my arm in, flipped on the bedroom light, and stepped inside. To my surprise, everything looked as it should. I checked the windows, locked. The closet door was shut. I started thinking maybe my eyes had played tricks on me. But as I was about to leave the room, I heard something faint. Music. Eerie, almost whimsical music coming from somewhere in the room. Confused, I moved toward the sound, and soon realized it was coming from the floor vent. I thought, what in the world? The music stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving an uneasy silence. I stood there, rooted in place, until a new sound broke the quiet. A scraping noise from the closet, followed by a distinct popping sound. Donk, donk, donk. A chill crept up my spine. It took me only a moment to recognize that sound, and it instantly covered me in goosebumps. My mom had given me this 2-foot-tall angel figurine years back, one that I had always found unsettling. The angel held a candle, a clear Christmas bulb, right under its chin, casting shadows over its face in an eerie way. When plugged in, its arm would move the candle in a slow arc, the plastic joints grinding and popping as it went. And when the wings moved, they made a hollow donk, donk, donk sound, exactly like what I was hearing now. But I knew that angel was in the closet, and there was no power running to it. The thought struck me hard. It's moving in the closet on its own. Sweat broke out on my forehead, my heart thudding as I considered opening the closet door. A part of me was desperate to fling it open and end the suspense, but a voice inside urged, "Leave this room, now." I backed out of the room, not even bothering to turn off the light, and closed the door firmly behind me. The next day, I called my mom and asked her to come over. When she arrived, I told her everything that had happened. She listened, her face growing more serious with each detail, and by the end, she suggested we get rid of the angel. She didn't need to tell me twice. We packed it up, and I'm pretty sure it ended up at a Goodwill donation center. I didn't care where it went, as long as it was out of my house. I'll never forget that night, the way Harley seemed to sense something before I even had a clue, and the sound of that angel moving without power. Even now, years later, the memory of it gives me chills. Some things just can't be explained, and sometimes they're better left alone. On February 23, 2011, my family moved into a new house. With 4 kids, we needed the extra space, and while moving is never easy, I thought this would be a positive change. But soon, we realized that our new home had a restless energy, spirits or entities that seemed to dwell within. The first day we bought the house, I was upstairs cleaning the bedrooms, bathroom, and closet. When I reached the closet outside my son's room, I felt a chilling presence, as if something sinister was staring right at me. I don't scare easily, so this feeling was unsettling, but I brushed it off. Later, my husband's preacher friend came to bless the house, and that's when things started to intensify. A glimpse of the past. Before we moved here, I'd had a few paranormal encounters. Once, while pregnant with my second child, my husband and I were lying on the hide-a-bed in the living room, with all the lights and TVs off, when we noticed a faint blue light coming from our daughter's room, similar to the glow of a TV on standby. Moments later, we saw a small white figure, no larger than our 18-month-old, walking from the hallway to the kitchen before vanishing. That experience, however, was nothing like what awaited us in this house. Encounter number 1. It was late summer or early autumn, one of those warm nights where it's hard to sleep. As I couldn't rest, I started folding laundry in my daughter's room. While working, I glanced into the living room and saw a pair of disembodied adult legs walk across the wide, doorless doorway. Everyone else in the house, including the dog, was upstairs asleep, though I noticed that the dog seemed unwilling to come downstairs until the next day. Despite how surreal it was, I didn't feel any immediate threat from this entity. Encounter number 2. On another late night, I was washing dishes when I suddenly heard the deep sound of someone laughing. I turned to see who it was and watched a dark figure dash across my daughter's room, leaping as if diving onto the bed. I quickly walked the few feet to their room, but it was gone. This figure seemed playful rather than threatening, almost as if it were some kind of prankster. Encounter number 3 and number 4. Several months later, while multitasking between cooking, laundry, and my laptop, I was standing at the washing machine as it switched cycles. Suddenly, I felt something grab my shoulder and pull me back from the washer. A few nights later, it happened again, but this time with more force. Despite the surprise, I didn't sense any danger. Instead, I felt it was protective. As it turned out, the washer had a leaky cord, which nearly electrocuted my husband during a later cycle. I began to think of this entity as the protector. Encounter number 5 and number 6. The sleep paralysis episodes. Unlike the other experiences, these 2 incidents were more menacing, and both happened during sleep paralysis. I have a history of dysfunctional sleep paralysis, meaning I'm fully aware of my surroundings and can use all my senses, which makes the episodes even more terrifying. I've never had hallucinations during these episodes, but that changed with these encounters. Encounter number 5 happened one November night. I woke to find myself paralyzed, facing my bedroom doorway. There, standing in front of the bathroom door, directly across from the eerie upstairs closet, was an enormous black figure. It slowly crossed the hall, and as soon as it disappeared, I snapped out of the paralysis. The figure felt distinctly evil. Encounter number 6 has puzzled me to this day. This episode happened during the late morning, and while it started like my other paralysis episodes, this one felt different. I was facing the foot of my bed, where a strange sight awaited me. A frizzy ball of light brownish-red hair, about 2 feet tall, materialized out of nowhere. It didn't look entirely human, and after a few seconds, it extended an arm, just a point, no fingers or hand, and directed it toward the window. I tried to look away but was physically unable to move my gaze from it. Suddenly, I was hit by a grand mal seizure. This was my first ever seizure with no family history of them. I still find this encounter terrifying. Researching it afterward, I only found one similar creature, the Cookagen, but I don't think that's what I encountered. Ever since, I've been left feeling drained, physically and mentally. Ongoing encounters. Since then, I've had smaller, less significant encounters, mostly auditory. I'll occasionally hear strange thuds, and at times voices call my name. While I don't know what's causing these events, I'm certain that our home has spirits or entities, some seemingly protective, others a bit more sinister. Each of these experiences leaves me with questions I can't answer, and though I've tried to find explanations, some things remain a mystery. When I was a junior in high school, I met a girl I'll call Jane to protect her privacy. We started talking online and soon began dating. Jane was a believer in the paranormal, and while I believed, I always felt the need for proof. Eventually, I got it. Jane was plagued by night terrors. She would wake up screaming, convinced that a creature was hunting her. Sometimes, late at night, she'd call, terrified, describing the same recurring nightmare. A creature slowly crawling down her hallway, stalking her. Occasionally, she'd see a dark mass waiting in one of the rooms, lurking as if it was anticipating her. Since I hadn't experienced it myself, all I could do was try to comfort her. One night, I was at her house, and for some reason, we were lying on the floor, watching a movie. She fell asleep on my arm and said she always slept better when I was around. As the movie played, I suddenly felt fingers run up my leg. I reached down to take her hand, but then realized I was already holding her hands. She often slept that way. The unseen fingers stopped at the top of my thigh. I looked around as best I could without waking her, but saw nothing. I didn't want to alarm her, so I kept it to myself, trying not to think about it. The idea of being touched by something invisible disturbed me, but I buried it in the back of my mind. Over time, Jane's night terrors worsened. She began running through the house in the middle of the night, screaming. Once, she accidentally blacked her stepdad's eye when he tried to wake her from a nightmare. She could only remember fragments of these dreams, mostly being chased by a black creature. Eventually, we broke up for unrelated reasons and lost touch. 6 years later, Jane and I reconnected and started dating again. Things were fine at first, but about a month in, she had a bad fight with her mother and begged me to let her move in with me. I agreed, and while I finished my shift at work, she packed her things and moved into my place. Those next 2 months were rocky. Jane seemed different, paranoid, anxious, and scared. Her night terrors returned in full force. She would scream and claw at the bed in her sleep, becoming increasingly aggressive. She even accused me of cheating on her. When I was at work, she claimed to hear voices and footsteps in my apartment. Eventually, we had a huge falling out. Things escalated to the point where she put one of my guns in my face, and I had to ask her to leave. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps in my hallway. Startled, I grabbed my pistol, thinking someone had broken in. The footsteps stopped right outside the living room. I crept forward, ready to confront the intruder, but when I rounded the corner, there was no one there. I checked every room, every closet, shouting for whoever it was to come out. But the doors were still deadbolt, and nothing had moved. Whatever it was had vanished. Months later, I was moved to another station, working 24-hour shifts in a nearby city. It was one of those days where everything seemed to go wrong. Just a typical Monday. My partner wasn't coming in until around 11 p.m., so I decided to take a nap, needing some rest after a long morning. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps behind me, close and heavy. Thinking my partner had arrived and was messing with me, I turned over and called him a creeper for watching me sleep. But there was no answer. I searched the station, checking every room, but there was no one. Confused, I called my dispatcher to see if my partner was hiding somewhere, playing a prank. But my dispatcher confirmed that my partner was still on his day shift, busy on a call. To this day, I don't know what those footsteps were or if they're connected to Jane's past or something else entirely. But whatever this presence is, it seems to have followed me, appearing in moments when I least expect it, as real as any person, yet utterly invisible. I'm pretty shaken up right now, and it's not even happening to me. It's happening to my girlfriend. I'll give a bit of context first. I'm 17, she's 22, and we've been together long enough to tell each other everything. This all went down just a few hours ago. She called to say goodnight, like always, and we told each other, "I love you," before hanging up. I left my phone in my room for a few minutes while I went to the living room. When I got back, I had 2 missed calls and a text that read, "Baby, I'm scared." I immediately replied, asking her what was wrong, but there was no answer. Then, she called me again. Before I get to what happened next, there's more you need to know. For the past few days, she's been waking up with mysterious bruises and even a long cut on her leg that she only noticed in the shower when the hot water hit it. Today, she found 2 new bruises on her head. I figured she might have hurt herself in her sleep or maybe bumped into something without realizing, but I didn't think much beyond that. She's also mentioned small things, objects in her room shifting, things falling, but I always thought she was just being silly or superstitious. When I answered her call, though, her voice was trembling, and I could tell she was on the verge of tears. She said there was a dark figure near her daughter's play cube in her room, just standing there, watching her. Hearing her say that hit me hard. My skin went cold, and my heart sank. I could barely speak, but I managed to ask her, "What?" She repeated it, saying it was a black mass, moving slightly but staring straight at her. I told her to try to grab her laptop and use its light to see if it would go away. Her room light switch is right next to where the thing was standing, so it was the only option. She built up the courage to grab the laptop, turned it on, and shined it toward the figure. It vanished. She broke down in tears, relief mixed with terror. We started talking about whether this thing could be the cause of her bruises and cuts. We were just beginning to process what happened when, suddenly, she screamed. Something had pulled her hair. That moment sent a chill down my spine, but at the same time, I felt an intense surge of anger. All I could think about was protecting her. I wanted to tear this thing apart, and that's not like me at all. I stayed on the phone with her until she finally fell asleep, just to make sure she was safe. But as my phone battery dropped to 12%, I started getting this wild idea that maybe I could somehow communicate with the thing. I told it to leave her alone and come after me instead. Then, I said, "Yeah, that's right. You're just a powerless little bee ****h. The moment I finished saying that, the call dropped. I looked at my phone, and it still had 8% battery left. It wasn't the phone that disconnected us. So here I am now. It's 2 a.m. in California, and I can't shake the feeling that something's really wrong. My girlfriend is back in Kentucky, and this happened between 10 p.m. and midnight for me, which is 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. her time. One other thing. While we were still on the call, I heard strange sounds coming from her end. It was faint, like background noise, but it almost sounded familiar, like a muted voice or a vehicle in the distance, coming in and out. It didn't interfere with her voice, which was clear, but it was still unnerving. My whole life, I've had experiences with spirits. The first one happened when I was about 5 years old, around 1972, when we lived in an old farmhouse in Breathitt County, Kentucky. It was a small, secluded 2-bedroom house on a few acres, with horse stalls out back and situated across the road from a river that eventually flooded and trapped us for a few days. Not long after we moved in, I began seeing the floating head of a man in the upper right corner of the bedroom I shared with my little sister. I had a difficult childhood and struggled to sleep at night. At first, this floating head terrified me, but over time it started saying comforting things, and I even began to look forward to its appearances. I tell it about my day, sharing feelings I kept to myself otherwise. One night, it asked me to follow it. Hesitantly, I got out of bed and followed the head as it floated through the living room and into my parents' room, an area I rarely entered. It passed by their bed and headed up to the attic, which was filled with belongings from the previous owner. Unbeknownst to me, my parents had woken up and were following me up the stairs. At the top landing, the head disappeared through a door that was always locked. Expecting it to be bolted, I turned the knob and it opened right up. I didn't even notice my parents behind me. Inside, I heard an odd noise that sounded like leather shifting, the familiar creak we'd hear from the old chair downstairs whenever someone stood up from it. My parents suddenly turned on the light, startling me. I hadn't realized they were there. They looked around and found that the attic was set up as a cozy office, with a leather chair at the desk. They asked if I'd ever been in the room before, and I explained that I just followed the head here, though they'd always insisted that I must be dreaming about it. Of course, they hadn't seen the head that night. The next day, my dad asked our landlord if anyone had died in the house. She explained that the house had been difficult to rent ever since her son had committed suicide there years earlier. The attic, she said, was full of his belongings. We had recently moved from Michigan and hadn't heard the story. She went on to say that he'd taken his own life by hanging himself from the large light outside the attic office window. The light, installed by the electric company, was meant to illuminate the entire yard, and he had tied a rope from the light to his neck and jumped. Sadly, he had been there for days before she found him. My dad later confided that he believed the long exposure could have resulted in decapitation. We moved out not long after, but before we could leave, my mother experienced something haunting as well. Her favorite brother, a coal miner from Harlan, had recently committed suicide after finding out about his wife's affair. In a tragic end, he'd used a 12-gauge shotgun on himself while lying in bed next to her. Some of our family never believed it was a suicide. One night, a few weeks later, my mother heard someone calling her name outside her bedroom window. When she listened more closely, she realized it was her late brother's voice. Though frightened, she grew curious. Gathering her courage, she looked out the window. There, she saw her brother dressed in his mining clothes, transparent and ghostly, calling her name. Startled, she shut the curtain and dove back into bed, hiding under the covers. She always regretted not listening to him that night, wondering if he might have revealed the truth about his death, whether it had truly been suicide or something more sinister. After these incidents, we moved into town next door to my great-grandma, who was rumored to practice witchcraft. Living close to her led to many more eerie experiences, which I'll share next time. As for the floating head, I'm convinced it was the spirit of our landlord's son. Perhaps he was just lonely and wanted companionship. It's an experience that has stayed with me all my life, a memory so vivid and strange that I could never forget it. My story takes place in April 1988 in the rural area of Shoulderblade, Kentucky. I was 20 and had just gotten married at our local church. The church generously offered us the parsonage to live in, and we gladly accepted, moving in right away. The first night, I was thrilled to have our own place. We settled in for the evening, and just as we got comfortable, we heard the unmistakable sound of the glass doorknob on our bedroom door turning back and forth. My husband got out of bed, grabbed his gun, and motioned for me to open the door. When I did, he stepped out, looked around, and found nothing. He checked the hallway and moved into the bathroom, where the light suddenly went out. He called to me to switch it back on, which I did, and he continued his search around the apartment, but everything appeared normal. The next day, I spent most of my time unpacking and putting things away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, especially in the kitchen where the largest windows were. I kept glancing outside, half expecting to see someone, but there was no one around. That evening, my husband and I were watching TV when, just as we were about to fall asleep, we heard loud shouting coming from upstairs in the chapel. I thought, why would anyone be here at this hour? The shouting was intense, though I couldn't make out specific words, and it gave me goosebumps. We were both uneasy and decided to check it out. As we reached the last step before entering the chapel, the shouting abruptly stopped. The first thing we noticed was the complete silence and emptiness of the chapel. It was pouring rain outside, yet there wasn't a single muddy footprint on the floor. That's when we realized we'd likely encountered something supernatural, maybe even something sinister. The rest of the night was quiet, but it took us a long time to fall asleep, praying for peace as we lay in bed. The following day, that unsettling feeling of being watched returned, especially in the kitchen. I decided to call my mother to tell her what had been happening. She offered to spend the night with us and brought my stepdad along. They came over with deli food, and we watched a few movies together. That night, everything was calm, and I almost convinced myself that I'd been imagining things. The next night, however, the eerie feeling returned. After visiting my in-laws, we went to bed, but once again, we heard the sound of the bedroom doorknob turning back and forth. This time, my husband jumped out of bed, flung open the door, and stepped into the hallway. After a moment, he slowly backed into the room, shut the door, and told me to get dressed. I quickly got ready, and he put on his shoes, took my hand, and led us toward the exit. Just before leaving, I glanced into the living room and saw it. A dark, floating mass moving back and forth near the window. It seemed to pace across the room, drifting toward the kitchen. My husband and I rushed to the truck, and as we drove away, I could still see the shadowy figure pacing inside. We headed straight to my in-laws and told them everything. My father-in-law was skeptical, but he agreed to go check the parsonage with my husband. They found nothing unusual. The next day, we told the preacher what had happened, and he came to bless the apartment and pray over it. He then explained why the parsonage had been vacant. The previous occupants had a son who was into witchcraft and had used a Ouija board in the small bedroom, which had been painted red. I'd always felt uneasy about that room and hadn't put anything in it yet. The preacher wished us well and told us to reach out if anything else occurred. Later that evening, I decided to take a bath and unwind before we planned to have dinner with my in-laws. As I sat in the tub, that disturbing feeling of being watched crept over me again. I closed the shower curtain, hoping it would give me some sense of privacy. Through the slightly translucent curtain, I saw the black, misty figure pass by, back and forth. Terrified, I quickly got out, dressed, and left the apartment. After that, I never spent another night in the parsonage. Within days, we found a new place to live. I'm convinced that whatever the previous tenant brought into that apartment didn't want to leave. I'd never thought a church could be haunted, but this experience changed my mind. To this day, the church has lost most of its members, and the current preacher has a troubling habit of using curse words in his sermons. I believe that dark entity is still at work there, lingering within the walls of that place. I live in a small rural town called Jackson in southeast Kentucky and attended Jackson City School, a small independent school. I played basketball there from 5th grade through my senior year, and I was a student from 1st grade until graduation. Between practices, dances, and other events, I spent a lot of time there, especially in the high school building where strange things seemed to happen, particularly in the girls' bathroom located in the basement. The basement bathroom was always chilly, and I hated being in there alone because I felt like someone was watching me. One time, I was alone in the last stall when, out of nowhere, the toilet in the next stall flushed by itself. I checked under the stall, but no one was there, and I hadn't heard anyone come in. I hurried and got out as fast as I could. Another time, while I was in the same bathroom, I heard a little girl humming a song I didn't recognize. Once again, no one was around, so I quickly left. Another incident happened during basketball practice. Our downstairs water fountain was broken, so my coach told me to use the one on the 2nd floor. When I reached the 2nd floor, it was pitch dark. I didn't know where the light switch was but figured I'd just get a quick drink and head back. As I leaned down to drink, I suddenly heard a little girl singing, "Ring Around the Rosie." My heart froze, and I took off down the steps as fast as I could. When I reached the gym, my coach commented that I looked like I'd just seen a ghost. I shared what happened, and he told me about the legend of a little girl. He said that, in the 1950s, a 6-year-old girl had fallen down the steps in the old grade school building, which later burned down in the 60s. She died from her injuries. He believed she might still linger there. And over the years, people had heard her singing, running, and playing, though no one had ever seen her. Hearing this gave me chills. The voice I'd heard upstairs was clearly that of a little girl. Even years later, I continued having dreams of that school and the eerie feelings it gave me. Oddly enough, years after graduating, I moved into a house right next to her grave. Her tombstone was just 15 feet from the house. I never felt at peace there. I've always attracted spirits, and the activity in that house was overwhelming, especially with the graveyard nearby, where my own father, grandmother, and other family members were also buried. At night, my son would complain about someone tapping on his window, the same window overlooking the little girl's grave. He told me it happened every night, so one evening, I decided to sleep in his room. Around 2 a.m., I heard it too, a rough, loud knocking on the glass. It had snowed heavily that night, so we went outside to check for footprints, but there were none. Other strange things happened regularly. DVDs and videos would be scattered as if someone had gone through them. Seasonings from the kitchen would go missing. We'd turn off all the lights, leave, and come back to find them all on again. Once, a friend from Michigan came to visit and took a shower in the basement. While she was down there, something moved her clothes around, placed her headset radio on top of the pile, and even pulled back the shower curtain while she was showering. Sometimes, when we'd pull into the driveway, we'd see the shadow of someone standing in the window, looking at us. But by the time we'd get out of the car, it would disappear. I often wondered if it was the little girl or perhaps the spirit of my kid's grandfather, who'd once lived there. His wake had been held in the living room of that very house. I don't know for sure if the spirit was the little girl who died at school, her spirit lingering both at the school and at her grave. But with her grave right outside, I couldn't shake the feeling she might be connected to the activity in the house. Or perhaps it was both her and the spirit of the grandfather. Either way, that house held memories and spirits that seemed tied together in ways I'll probably never fully understand. In 1988, my second wife and I moved into a house I had purchased from my brother and his wife. The history of the house was dark. Her first husband had tragically ended his life by shooting himself in the master bedroom. Unable to bear living there, they rented it out until they moved out of state and I bought it. For a while, everything was normal, but then we started having issues that hinted at something beyond our understanding, a lingering presence. It began subtly. My wife mentioned seeing a figure of a man standing in our bedroom in the middle of the night, but we brushed it off as her imagination. Then, objects around the house would mysteriously move. We'd leave something on one table, only to find it on another or even on the floor when we returned. The atmosphere grew stranger with each unexplained event. One night, while we were watching TV in the living room, the basement television suddenly switched on at full volume. It startled us both. I was sure no one was in the house but us. I rushed downstairs, turned off the TV, and checked every corner of the basement. Finding nothing, I went back upstairs, but within minutes, the TV blared to life again. Frustrated, I unplugged it and moved it to the center of the room, hoping that would put an end to it. Still, the sensation of something unnatural lingered. The mounting experiences were wearing on my wife. She was terrified that this ghost might actually harm us, so much so that she wanted to sell the house and leave. Not wanting to abandon our home, I suggested we call my parents, who were ministers, to see if they could help with an exorcism. They agreed to come over that evening. Together, they prayed over each room, blessing every corner of the house and even the garage with holy water. After that night, things calmed down, and for the next 6 years we lived in peace. However, the peace didn't last forever. Unexpectedly, my wife began claiming to see black demons, calling her to the dark side. Her mental state spiraled, and she grew convinced they wanted her to end her life. I took her to the hospital, where the doctor diagnosed her as paranoid and manic-depressive, with delusional episodes. She stayed overnight on suicide watch and was prescribed medication, which seemed to help. She returned home, and over the next few months she seemed to improve. But the calm was temporary. Without telling me, she decided to stop taking her medication, convinced she no longer needed it. Gradually, she became erratic, prone to intense anger over the smallest things. One evening, I hadn't moved a box to the basement fast enough for her liking. As I stepped out the front door toward the yard, she hurled a heavy mug of iced tea at me, narrowly missing my ear. The mug shattered against the iron gate, leaving glass strewn across the driveway. The situation grew more dangerous. A few days later, we were in the kitchen when she became upset and threw a cast iron skillet at me. I dodged it, but it crashed through the sheetrock. I patched up the hole, but only 2 days later, as I started down the basement stairs, she shouted for me to wait. I was halfway down when she kicked me from behind. I tumbled down the steps, slamming hard against the wall at the bottom. I hadn't been seriously hurt, but I knew I couldn't stay any longer under these conditions. I told her I would move out unless she resumed her medication. Her response was chilling. She yelled at me, but in a voice that was unmistakably that of a man. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just her struggles with mental health. Something darker, Something malevolent seemed to have taken hold of her. I suggested another exorcism, this time for her. She refused outright, her behavior becoming increasingly hostile. With no other options, we separated and ultimately we divorced. A year after the divorce, I heard she tried to harm her new boyfriend by pushing him out of a moving car. She lives alone now, refusing help from anyone, isolated and unapproachable. In the end, I never imagined our relationship would unravel this way, but there was only so much I could do. She cut all contact, so I don't know for certain, but I fear that the presence we tried to banish from the house might still linger, either within its walls or, worse, within her. I was a quiet teenager, spending most of my time with my books and art. Socializing wasn't my thing, and I always felt more comfortable in my own company than surrounded by people. My older sister was the opposite. She was outgoing, confident, athletic, and had a friend circle that never seemed to end. We were close, but her confidence and popularity only made me feel more invisible, especially around boys. I was shy, and flirting just didn't come naturally to me. Then, one summer, a boy started paying attention to me. Adam was charming, confident, and effortlessly funny. For the first time, I felt noticed, like maybe I wasn't as invisible as I thought. We went to dances, shared laughs, and I started to think that maybe I wasn't the girl people overlooked. Felt like something out of a story, until one night, everything fell apart. That night, Adam and I were sitting under the stars when he suddenly confessed that he didn't really see me as more than a friend. His interest, he admitted, had always been in my sister. I felt the world crash down on me. I was crushed. How could he use me like that? For days, I tried to hold it together, but I couldn't escape the heartbreak. Every night that week, I lay in my bed, crying silently, wondering why he'd lied to me, why he'd built me up only to tear me down. I felt foolish, invisible again, and the pain was unbearable. One night, as I lay there in bed with fresh tears stinging my eyes, I realized I couldn't stand to be in my room anymore. I couldn't bear the silence that seemed to amplify my hurt. It was as if the walls were pressing in on me, stifling every breath. In a sudden burst of frustration, I climbed out of my window, barefoot and desperate for escape, and let the night carry me wherever it wanted. The streets were empty, every house silent. I wandered, feeling both free and completely alone. The streetlights cast long shadows, and as I walked, those shadows felt like company, though not exactly comforting. I wasn't used to the quiet of the night, and it gave me a strange feeling, like the world had momentarily shifted just for me. After a while, I found myself at a small, deserted park. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze. In the dim light, the swing set, the slides, and the merry-go-round all looked frozen in time. I walked over to a spot between two trees, my favorite place as a kid. The memories of those carefree days flooded back, and I felt a sudden wave of sadness at how everything had changed. I sank to the ground between the trees and let my emotions pour out, whispering to the shadows about my pain, hoping the night would somehow carry it away. "Why?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Why did you hurt me? Why wasn't I enough?" The words felt like they dissolved into the darkness around me, as if the night was listening, absorbing each heartbroken word. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I was lying on the cool grass, not moving. My mind felt heavy, and it took me a moment to realize where I was. Then, out of the silence, I heard a soft, unfamiliar voice beside me. "She's hurting?" the voice murmured, sounding oddly concerned. My eyes flew open, and I tried to move, but I felt frozen in place. A young man around my age was crouched beside me, his face pale yet gentle. He had dark, intense eyes that seemed to look right into me. Dressed in old-fashioned clothing, he looked like someone from another time. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered, his voice gentle but firm. I wanted to ask him who he was, but I found myself unable to speak. "How can anyone treat you like this?" he continued, as though he understood everything I was feeling. "But sadness isn't a reason to give up. There is so much more for you ahead." Finally, I managed to whisper, "Who are you?" The young man looked at me with a soft smile, and instead of answering, he lay down beside me on the grass, looking up at the stars. His presence was calming, and the words he spoke were reassuring, almost like he knew exactly what I needed to hear. He told me about people who'd felt like me and how they found their way through. His voice was steady, and though I didn't know him, I felt safe in his company. Eventually, I realized it was late, and I needed to get home. When I told him, he nodded, helping me to my feet. "Go home," he said gently. "But remember, even when people hurt you, life has more to offer. This pain is temporary. You have a future waiting for you, filled with people who will see your worth." As I turned to leave, he pulled me into a gentle hug. I'd never felt a hug like that before. It was comforting, warm, as if he was somehow taking away all the sadness. "You're going to be okay," he whispered. "And don't ever think that pain is your forever. There is joy ahead, and you will find it." I turned back to thank him, but he had already started to fade into the shadows, leaving me with a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in days. As I walked home, his words echoed in my mind, and by the time I climbed back through my window, I felt lighter, as though he'd helped me carry the weight of my heartbreak, even if just a little. Months went by, and as winter arrived, life tested me in ways I hadn't expected. My grandfather passed away unexpectedly, followed by the loss of a cousin and, later, an uncle. The grief felt heavy, almost unbearable at times, but whenever I felt myself sinking, I remembered the young man's words. Somehow, his quiet strength stayed with me, as if he knew I would face more heartache and wanted to prepare me for it. I don't know who he was or why he came to me that night, but he gave me a gift I could never forget. The reminder that even in the darkest times, hope waits patiently, ready to return when we're ready to see it again. In the summer of 2004, my husband, our 2-year-old daughter, and I moved from Wyoming to a small town in Pocatello, Idaho. We were excited to settle into our new home, which was a charming yet slightly eerie house built in the 1920s, now divided into 3 separate apartments. Ours was on the ground floor, left side. The initial excitement of the move, however, was soon clouded by strange occurrences that left us questioning the true nature of our new home. At first, it was easy to dismiss the odd happenings as moving stress or coincidences. Items would vanish only to reappear exactly where I'd left them, as if someone were playing a game with me. There were also strange sounds echoing through the house, especially at night. Sometimes, I'd hear the light, playful sounds of children laughing and running upstairs, which would have been fine if there had been children living above us. But the apartment was occupied by a single man, who rarely had visitors and, more often than not, wasn't home. I was open to the possibility of spirits, but my husband was ever the skeptic, convinced there had to be a rational explanation. Things escalated a few months after we moved in. One day, we came home to find an entire roll of toilet paper unraveled and strewn across the bathroom floor. My husband immediately blamed our 5-pound chihuahua, but even he had to admit it was unlikely that such a small dog could reach the roll, much less unroll it with such precision. This happened repeatedly, but the incident that finally unsettled him was when he witnessed it happening. As he shaved in the bathroom one morning, he saw the roll begin to spin on its own, unraveling faster and faster until the paper formed a messy pile on the floor. He stood there, stunned, and was finally forced to consider that something beyond the physical world might be at play. This was when we began to suspect that our unseen guest might be a mischievous child spirit. Our suspicions were further confirmed when Samantha, a close friend, brought over an acquaintance who happened to be sensitive to the supernatural. Without knowing anything about our experiences, he grew visibly uncomfortable as he glanced around the living room. "There's a little girl here," he said quietly, describing her with dark hair and wearing a frilly blue dress. She was standing, he explained, in the corner of the room watching us. He seemed so unnerved that he quickly excused himself, leaving with a nervous glance back. While I never saw the little girl myself, I had often sensed a playful yet curious presence in the house. However, there was also another presence, a dark, malevolent one. I often felt it nearby, especially when I was alone in the room. This entity seemed to carry a different energy altogether, one that made me feel uneasy, as though I was unwelcome. One night, I was half asleep in bed while my husband played video games in the living room. With my eyes closed, I suddenly heard slow, heavy footsteps moving from the kitchen toward the bedroom. The steps halted at the doorway, and I heard my husband's voice softly calling my name. "What?" I mumbled, still groggy, but there was no response. I opened my eyes, looked toward the door, and froze. A shadowy figure leaned against the doorway, an outline just barely visible in the dark. I realized instantly it was not my husband. Panic washed over me, and I gathered the courage to whisper, "Go away!" The figure vanished, leaving an unsettling void in its place. Shaken, I went to the living room where I found my husband on the couch, completely absorbed in his game. He hadn't heard or seen anything, but when he saw how frightened I was, he took my fear seriously for the first time. I was disturbed by how the entity had mimicked my husband's voice, as though trying to lure me into trusting it. After that incident, I was eager to leave the apartment. The unnerving sense of being watched and manipulated weighed heavily on me. My friend suggested that it could have been a spirit guide, but nothing about the shadowy figure felt protective or benign. Whatever it was, I felt it was more sinister, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wanted something from me. I started searching for a new place to live. Once we'd secured a new apartment, the atmosphere in the old one seemed to shift, almost as if the spirits knew we were preparing to leave. On our final day in the apartment, I was packing my collection of books when, suddenly, a curtain rod from the window came crashing down, missing my head by mere inches. I looked up in shock to see that it hadn't merely slipped or come loose. The rod, with the screw still attached, had been forcibly yanked from the wall. My husband inspected the hole, and he confirmed it hadn't fallen naturally. It felt like a final, angry message from the spirits. That was the last straw. We hurriedly packed the remaining items, wanting to leave before anything else could happen. As we walked out the door, I took a moment to say a quiet prayer for the spirits we were leaving behind, hoping that they would one day find peace. Leaving that apartment behind felt like a release. We moved on, yet the experience left a lasting impression on us. While I still wonder about the little girl in her blue dress, I am relieved to be far away from the shadowy presence that lurked in the doorway, knowing that some mysteries are better left unsolved. In October 1992, I found myself driving from Pensacola to Orlando to meet two of my closest Navy friends, Smitty and Woody. Smitty was on leave, wanting to introduce us to his fiancée, Jen, and had a mysterious favor to ask as well. We had bonded on the USS Islewin and were known as the Wreckin' Crew. Getting the gang back together sounded perfect, and I hit the road right after my class ended. Once in Orlando, we met up, and after some time catching up, Jen shared her story. She and her cousins had been using a Ouija board in her cousin's trailer and believed they'd stirred something up. People felt watched, lights and the TV turned on and off by themselves, and shadows moved just beyond vision. There was also a distinct smell, which she refused to reveal, saying she wanted to see if we'd pick up on it ourselves. The next evening, we gathered at Jen's cousin's trailer, bringing along an assortment of tools: white candles, sage for smudging, dragon's blood and sandalwood incense, tarot cards, and a Bible. As we set everything up on Smitty's truck tailgate, Woody, the classic skeptic, ribbed us with jokes. Once it was dark, we approached the trailer. The porch light flickered erratically. We stepped inside, Woody heading to the kitchen while Smitty and I prepared in the living room. Smitty began smudging each room with sage, saying blessings first in a Native American language, then reading from Psalms. Meanwhile, I arranged candles and incense in the living room, where we planned to focus our cleansing ritual. As Smitty entered the bathroom, we heard the back door slam open and shut. A peacock cried out in the distance, and suddenly, the air was thick with the distinct, musty odor of a wet dog. Woody, ever the skeptic, chuckled and claimed it was just the wind. But the look Smitty and I exchanged said otherwise. Once Smitty finished smudging, he joined me in the living room. Together, we called the spirit to join us in the final room. About 30 minutes later, the peacock cried again, Footsteps echoed on the back porch, and the door slowly creaked open, then shut. That familiar, pungent smell hit us again, stronger than before. "Whose dog is that?" Woody muttered, suddenly looking uncertain. Just then, his chair, with him still sitting on it, began sliding across the floor. Without missing a beat, I simply said, "Yeah, I smell it too." I began focusing, picturing a small white light growing from the flame of the candle in front of me. As I prayed, I envisioned the light expanding to fill the room and encompass the entire trailer, casting out any lingering spirits. Then came the sound of footsteps pounding across the floor. That wet dog stench swept past us, and the back door slammed open and shut one last time. The peacock let out a final cry. Woody left that night with a few questions about his skepticism, and as far as I know, that trailer has been quiet ever since. Over the years, life took us in different directions, and the wrecking crew drifted apart. But I still remember that night vividly, the first time I cleansed a space, and a night that left us all, even Woody, with something to ponder. And the smell Jen had kept secret? You guessed it. The unmistakable scent of a large, wet dog. Oh. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Oh. In April 1995, I was 5 months pregnant with my only child. My mother had passed away suddenly a year before, and her absence left me feeling alone and fearful. All I wanted was to be a mom, but with only my older sister as support, I felt incredibly isolated. I had just moved into a rented room in a woman's home and had a phone line installed. Cell phones were out of reach for me back then. Soon after, the phone rang, and I picked it up, only to be met with silence. No one spoke, but I felt an eerie sense of dread, as though someone was urgently trying to get my attention. The call lingered for a few moments before I hung up. I tried to trace it, but it was untraceable. Shortly after, my son's father bought me a one-way ticket to my sister's town, where I prepared for my son's birth. I stayed in that town until my son was 3 years old. I didn't dwell on the strange phone calls, but looking back, I remember that those silent, untraceable calls would still happen occasionally in my apartment. Even when I visited my sister, she would also receive the same silent, untraceable calls. Eventually, I moved 3 hours away to take a job and didn't have my own phone line for about a year. I struggled to keep a job, and my son and I ended up in a homeless shelter for families while waiting for a Section 8 apartment to open up. My son was almost 4 years old while we were there. In the shelter, we had a room in a very old building. My son began telling me that he felt a hand on his back at night. When I tried to reassure him that it was just me, he said, "No, the hand presses on my back and talks to me. When I look at you, Mommy, you're asleep." I didn't know what to make of it. By the time my son turned 4, we finally moved into our own apartment. I had a phone line installed, but a stressful job meant I would often come home and cry before picking up my son from preschool. That's when the strange calls started again, ringing off the hook the moment I walked in the door. Always silent, always untraceable. They would stop when my son was home, as if someone were watching me, waiting for me to be alone. The calls began to feel ominous, so I begged the phone company for help. They finally set up a caller ID that blocked unknown numbers, and the calls stopped completely. In early September 2001, after my father had passed away in another state, I took my son to visit a friend. When we got home around 9 p.m., I noticed a call had come in around 8 p.m. with no message left. The next morning, I called the number back, and it led to the phone company. They were confused, telling me that no one from their office could have called me at that time, as no one would have been there that late. I brushed it off and forgot about it. On the evening of September 10, 2001, I visited my friend again and returned home after 9 p.m. When I checked the phone, the same number had called again at 8 p.m. with no message. The following day, September 11th, changed everything. I never received another call like that again, and looking back, I wonder if it was my mother trying to reach me. A subtle attempt to remind me that she was still there, watching over us. I was so alone and depressed during those years, but eventually, I managed to escape poverty, and today my son and I have a much better life. I can only assume she was reaching out in her own way, though it felt eerie at the time. This happened about a year ago. Some friends and I do amateur ghost hunting. Nothing too serious, though I've picked up some decent equipment along the way. We decided to visit a graveyard one night. I wouldn't call myself psychic, but I am sensitive to the energy around me. At this point in my life, I had recently come out of a serious depression, and I felt an unusual pull to this place, like the energy was somehow drawing me in. That feeling would soon make sense. As we arrived and walked toward a large tree, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure that looked like the head and shoulders of a man, just passing by. I didn't mention it immediately, but then my buddy asked, "Did you see that?" I asked him what he saw before I said anything, and his description matched mine exactly. It looked like someone walked by and disappeared before the fence. Only it was just the upper half of their body. Creepy, right? We continued on, did some EVP recordings, but didn't sense anything else, so we decided to call it a night and review our findings later. When I listened back to the EVPs a day or two later, I was surprised to hear a child's voice responding faintly behind my friend's questions, which were just standard questions like, "Was that you we just saw walking through the yard?" And, "Is there anyone here who'd like to speak to me?" The child's voice sounded intelligent. It even answered his questions. When he asked, "Was that you we just saw walking through the yard?" the response was a soft "mommy." And then, as I walked away from my friend, the voice clearly called out, "Wait for me!" It was the clearest EVP we'd ever recorded, and we were thrilled. Naturally, we had to go back and try to capture more. This time, we brought toys and a blanket, hoping to lure the child's spirit. But the second visit was strange in other ways. My recorder kept shutting off in the middle of sessions, though I did manage to capture another child's voice. It wasn't the same child, but a different voice, about the same age, clearly saying, "The blanket," before the recorder shut off again. Around the same time, I felt a weird tingling, like something was tugging at my belt. The whole yard felt alive with strange activity. A pinwheel by one of the headstones started spinning, even though there was no breeze, and when we asked it to spin the other way, it did. Then, things got even stranger. About a week after that night, I started noticing odd happenings around my house. I would catch sight of a small figure near the stairs, just in my peripheral vision. Items I always kept in one place, like my keys or phone, would disappear or move like something was playing tricks on me. And then it got even more direct. One night, I was sitting alone on the couch when I heard what sounded like nursery rhyme humming, right in my ear. It scared the life out of me. I asked, "Is this the child I recorded last week?" And immediately heard the humming again. For some reason, I bolted to the bathroom. Eventually, I gathered my courage, went back to the couch and pulled out my recorder. But every time I turned it on, it would shut off by itself. I changed the batteries, and it still happened. The few times it did stay on, I caught faint footsteps, like someone walking up to the recorder, followed by static before it turned off again. At one point, I even felt pressure on the couch, like someone had just sat down next to me. It was unnerving, but I reminded myself that this is the kind of experience every ghost hunter hopes for. Other small things happened too, like the fan turning on by itself, and seeing what looked like someone going up and down the stairs when I was the only one home. It became so normal that I found myself calling out to it. Eventually, the activity stopped. I guess I started ignoring it, and it faded. I never got a negative feeling from it. It felt more like someone trying to say hello. Sometimes I wonder if it was drawn to me because I'd recently come out of that depressive state, and maybe it sensed that. Who knows? But it's definitely an experience I'll never forget. When I was around 9, my family lived in a beautiful, peaceful house in a popular neighborhood in Idaho. It wasn't particularly old and had 2 stories, but in northern states, the second story is sometimes below ground. Our upstairs had all our main rooms, kitchen, bedrooms, bathrooms, living room, while the downstairs was more unfinished, just cement floors and framed walls. My dad eventually tore down the unfinished walls and turned the entire downstairs into a large playroom, complete with a TV, computer, and treadmill. As an early Christmas gift, I got my first puppy, a little Shetland sheepdog, just a couple of months old. During the day, while I was at school and my parents were at work, we'd keep him in the downstairs bathroom to prevent any puppy mischief. Soon after, I convinced my parents to let me ride the bus home so I could spend more time with him instead of going to daycare. On my first day home alone, I went downstairs to play with my puppy in our new playroom. After calling my mom to let her know I was home, I was watching TV with my puppy sitting next to me on the couch when I heard slow, steady footsteps coming down the stairs. The sound stopped at the door, which was shut to keep my puppy from running upstairs. Then I noticed the doorknob turning, as if someone was trying to open it. The door gently opened halfway, but when I looked up, expecting to see my mom, I saw nothing, just the empty stairway and wall. At this point, I wasn't even scared. I just assumed my mom was playing a trick on me. I called out, "Mom?" But no one answered. I looked down at my puppy, and he was staring intensely at the open door. His ears perked, his body still as a statue. He didn't bark, growl, or move, but he was clearly focused on something I couldn't see. After about 30 seconds, the door suddenly slammed shut, as if someone had pulled it hard. I heard the footsteps again, this time quickly rushing back up the stairs. I sat there, stunned, trying to understand what had just happened. My puppy looked up at me with the same confused expression, like he was just as baffled as I was. For him, staying perfectly still was impressive enough, as he was a normally energetic little pup. Eventually, I gathered the courage to go upstairs. I picked up my puppy and checked the house. Everything was as it should be. The doors were locked, the garage was empty. My mom's car wasn't there. It was clear that my puppy and I were alone. I didn't feel afraid or in any danger, just curious. Somehow, it felt like whatever it was didn't expect us to be there. In the 2 years we lived in that house, I never saw it again, and my parents never mentioned anything unusual. My puppy grew up happy and healthy, and while he sometimes tossed his toys in the air, once or twice I thought they hung mid-air, like someone else was playing with him, though that could have been my imagination. I continued to come home after school and never felt worried about the experience. If there was a spirit in the house, it didn't seem interested in scaring me and kept its distance. It just felt peaceful. I never tried to contact it or anything, but that one encounter sparked my interest in the paranormal. Today, I'm 22 and still remember it clearly. My dog passed away a couple of years ago, but he was always a joyful companion. I remain a firm believer in ghosts. Not all of them show themselves clearly, and sometimes you have to pay attention to small, subtle signs. Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't there. I've been living in my apartment for about 5 years now, and while I've had a few paranormal experiences in my life, nothing compares to what I've encountered here. 5 months after moving in, the activity began. I was lying in bed watching Looney Tunes on YouTube when I noticed something moving in the bathroom out of the corner of my eye. Trying to see it without fully turning my head was a struggle, especially since I wasn't wearing my glasses, but I could make out a faint white blur on the bathroom ceiling. When I turned my head slightly to get a better look, I saw a pale white figure. It had horns and wings but no tail or glowing eyes. It didn't look like a shadow or anything transparent. It was solid, like an actual person. Oddly enough, I didn't feel threatened. It was more like it was just curious about what I was doing. I never saw it again after that, though several of my friends have mentioned seeing him when they visited. I call him Mr. White. About a month later, I was reading some ghost stories late at night about new tenants hearing strange banging noises in their attics. Just as I started to drift off to sleep, I heard a loud cracking noise from the attic above my bed, like beams and rafters snapping. My heart raced as I bolted upright, half expecting the roof to collapse. I learned a valuable lesson that night. Never read ghost stories right before bed. But while I started ignoring those late-night stories, the strange sounds in the attic didn't stop. After my encounter with Mr. White and the attic noises, things quieted down a bit. I'd occasionally see a shadow move across the wall or catch something darting past in the corner of my eye, but nothing too alarming. Then I made the mistake of watching Paranormal Activity, and that seemed to unleash a whole new level of activity in the apartment. Right after watching the movie at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I felt a sinister energy that literally chased me out of my apartment. I was so spooked that I spent the night at my dad's house just to calm down. After that, I reassured myself that whatever was there couldn't hurt me, and I returned to my usual life. But since that experience, things have only intensified. I've seen the shadow of a little girl standing next to the toilet, and at the same time, a white mist in the shape of a man casually leaning against the bathroom sink. I've also seen an older man in my kitchen, heard a protective growl coming from behind my recliner, though I don't have any pets, and spotted a spirit ball about the size of a bowling ball on the top shelf of my closet. Occasionally, I even get visits from animal spirits. When the cats are around, the room smells like kitty litter, and when dogs are nearby, the apartment smells like wet dog. I also found out that a spirit named Emma, a 7-year-old girl, has been following me for 20 years, ever since I was a kid. I'm 26 now, so she's been with me for most of my life. 2 years ago, a former friend's mom, who is a registered psychic medium, came to check out my apartment. She told me something disturbing. I'm apparently sharing my apartment with 2 demons, 1 male and 1 female. She explained that they don't like or hate me, but they respect my personality and tend to avoid me, staying mostly in my closets. For a studio apartment, I happen to have a lot of closet space. They've never harmed me, and if they come near, they seem to behave themselves. Strangely, almost all the spiritual energy in my apartment seems to come from the bathroom. And let me tell you, it's quite a shock when you're taking a relaxing hot shower and suddenly feel an icy chill right next to you. Ever since watching Paranormal Activity, the energy in this place went from barely noticeable to constant. I have no idea why the movie would have such an effect, but my apartment's paranormal activity hasn't let up since. This happened last year in March, and though I've never posted a story before, this experience left me so shaken that I haven't been able to forget it. I've only shared it with close friends and family because of how disturbing it was. I was in my history class, wide awake. I had actually napped in my previous class, so I wasn't tired at all. My teacher had put on a movie about the Great Depression, and since there wasn't enough room in the main school building, this class was held in a trailer just outside. The trailer had 4 big windows, so even though the lights were off, sunlight poured into the room. It was typically warm in there, and I rarely got chills, especially while wearing my sweatshirt. About 15 minutes into the movie, though, I suddenly felt a chill run through me. At first, I brushed it off, thinking I was just cold from sitting still, but the chill grew stronger until my teeth began to chatter. I checked the thermostat. It was set to 76 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius. I even asked my friends if they were cold, but they said they felt fine, some even saying it was too hot. That's when I felt an intense wave of tiredness hit me out of nowhere, like a switch had flipped. It wasn't gradual. It just washed over me. I couldn't fight it, so I put my head down, telling myself I'd only rest for a few minutes. As I drifted off, I started to dream, or at least I hope it was a dream. I remember the feeling of sleep paralysis setting in, and then I found myself sitting up in the classroom, but it was completely empty. The room felt like it had been abandoned for a long time, with a light snow falling outside the windows and dusk settling in. Despite the eerie stillness, I didn't feel bothered at first. But then, a chill settled over the room, and I could see my own breath in the cold, musty air. Everything grew darker, and then, out of nowhere, bony, pale hands appeared from behind me, reaching forward. I couldn't see who or what they belonged to, but I could feel them pulling at me, grabbing my hair, my clothes, my arms. Anything they could get a hold of with their long, bony fingers. I tried to scream, but no sound would come out. I was frozen in fear, unable to move. Just as quickly as the hands had appeared, they vanished, and I felt my body relax, able to breathe again. But before I could fully calm down, I felt 2 icy fingers press hard into my left bicep, piercing through my sweatshirt as if it weren't even there. Then I woke up, back in the classroom. The movie was still playing, the room was warm again, and I felt a cold spot on my arm right where the fingers had touched me. I rubbed my arm, feeling the chill still lingering through the fabric. I turned to my friend Amy, who sat behind me, and asked if she tried to wake me up. She looked at me strangely and said no. no one had touched me or tried to wake me. Unable to explain what had just happened, I turned back around, shaken by how real it had felt. That night, I struggled to sleep, haunted by the memory of those hands. I'll never forget the detail of those two cold fingers pressing into my arm, or the sight of the hands, like something out of a nightmare. They reminded me of the hands of the Dementors from Harry Potter. Charred bone with abnormally long fingers and thick nails, tinted a dark, rotting purple. The memory of those fingers, and the raw fear I felt, still sends chills through me. I've been working at a small mall in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, for the past 4 years. I started as a part-time custodian while also working at Taco Time, and now I'm a security guard. Of my 3 shifts, 2 are graveyard shifts, and I've had experiences here that are too strange to write off as imagination. The first incident happened during a closing shift as a custodian. It was almost midnight, and I had 15 minutes left before clocking out. There was no graveyard security back then, so I was alone in the entire mall. I decided to hustle and vacuum the last few entrance and corridor rugs, leaving only one left by Macy's. This particular corridor had an antique shop near the exit. I opened the corridor's double doors and saw that one of the fluorescent lights at the far end was out, but the other lights were working, so I didn't think much of it. However, as I walked down the hallway, I noticed that the end of the corridor was pitch black. I couldn't make out the wall at all, even though there was plenty of light behind me. As I approached the darkness, an overwhelming feeling hit me. I wasn't wanted here. The sensation was so sudden and intense that I immediately fled, shutting the doors behind me without looking back. After that, I became convinced that something was haunting the mall. I'd had enough unexplained experiences in the past to recognize when something felt real, and this overwhelming sensation was definitely more than just imagination. The second incident wasn't as intense but still strange. I was working a closing shift at Taco Time, killing time towards the end of a slow night. I was sitting next to the fridge, listening to music, when the fridge door suddenly swung open by itself. That fridge never had trouble staying closed. The seals were solid. I remember looking at the door and saying, "Could you shut that when you're finished?" I even thanked it, shut the door, and went on with closing, shaking my head at the prankster spirit. The third incident happened just last week during my graveyard shift, down the same corridor as my first experience. Until then, my graveyard shifts had been uneventful. I'd grown used to the feeling of being watched but hadn't encountered anything else. But last week changed that. It was around 3 a.m., and I was doing my second round of the building. As soon as I opened the Macy's corridor doors, that familiar sensation hit me again. This time, I heard a soft humming, like the faint sound of an idling vehicle. I paused to listen, trying to figure out what it could be, and then continued down the hallway toward the exit. But as I got closer, the sensation intensified. I was definitely not welcome there. The humming stopped, leaving the corridor dead silent. Just as I was about to hit my button, a loud clang echoed through the hallway. I couldn't help but scream, both in fear and frustration, feeling as if something was toying with me. Every nerve in my body was tingling with fear, yet my adrenaline kept me rooted in place. I hit the button and stormed out of the corridor, feeling as if a massive presence was going to swallow me whole. I've dealt with paranormal experiences before, but this one got under my skin. I feel like something is slowly working its way into my mind, amplifying my fears. Tonight, I have another graveyard shift, and I'm dreading it. Ironically, before this happened, I'd been giving my girlfriend advice on handling that watched feeling she was getting at home. I told her to embrace the strength of her spirit, spread her aura throughout the house, and that selflessness and love deter evil spirits. But that same night, it felt like an entity had found a way to break through my own defenses. When I was about 7, I had a bedroom upstairs where my brother's room, a spare room, and a bathroom were also located. One night, I was in that strange state between sleep and wakefulness and felt like my whole room was moving, almost like I was on a boat. Eventually, I woke fully, able to move again, and decided to go to the bathroom, which was down the hall just past the stairwell. As I walked out of my room, I felt an unusual urge to look over towards my brother's open bedroom door. He was sound asleep, but something made me keep glancing in his direction. The air felt heavy and cold. A strange sensation, especially in the summer when our upstairs was always warm, even with the AC running near the stairwell. Then, as I looked down the hallway a second time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Two large, red glowing eyes staring out from under my brother's bed. It didn't make any sense because the space under his bed was always crammed with clothes, toys, and random stuff. He wasn't exactly the tittiest kid. We had a cat and a dog, but the cat was usually outside at night during the summer, and our dog was too big to fit under the bed. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. My parents' room was downstairs, so it took them what felt like forever to reach me. By the time they got there, I was hysterical, and when I finally told them what I'd seen, they dismissed it as part of a bad dream. They tried to calm me down, but I was too shaken to go to the bathroom alone that night. My parents thought I was being ridiculous. After that experience, I took precautions to avoid seeing under my bed at night. I would prop up books along the base of my bed, and I'd run and jump onto it after turning off the lights so I wouldn't have to stand near the gap underneath. For a long time, I refused to go into my brother's room. Even now, I still believe that what I saw was a demon or some kind of dark presence. When I was 13, my parents told me something surprising. They said that I used to sleepwalk. I had no memory of it, but they said they'd often find me trying to open the front door at night, so they started deadbolting it. I'd only try to unlock the regular doorknob, never the deadbolt. I sometimes wonder if my sleepwalking was connected to the negative presence I sensed. My parents also eventually shared a strange experience they'd had after moving into the house. They had a crocheted star hanging in a metal ring on a string with a suction cup hook in one of the windows. One day, they noticed it swinging side to side in a steady rhythm, even though all the doors and windows were closed. They said it moved too much to be caused by a draft, and there was no report of an earthquake. This happened soon after they bought the house as newlyweds, before they'd even had my brother and me. These incidents occurred over years, but the feelings of unease were constant. The house was built sometime in the 1920s or 1930s, and I always felt a heavy, negative energy there. Moving out was a huge relief. I was finally free of that weight I'd always felt. Since then, I've realized I'm more open to paranormal experiences and even psychic dreams, which makes me wonder if that's why I was more sensitive to these energies than my family. Could the sleepwalking have been caused by the negative presence in the house? Or was it simply an odd coincidence? I plan to share more of my paranormal experiences from that house and other places, but I often wonder if my openness to these events is what made me a magnet for them. After graduating high school, I started working as a certified nursing assistant, CNA, at a local nursing home. I planned to work full-time during the summer before college, then shift to part-time during the school year, mostly working weekends. To balance my schedule, I started working night shifts, allowing me to attend classes during the day. Shortly after starting, some of my coworkers shared a story with me about a little girl spirit. The story went that a young girl appeared to residents about a week before they passed away. Having had other paranormal experiences before, I kept an open mind about it. A few nights later, around 2:30 or 3 a.m., I was doing my charting at the nurse's station when I heard the sound of men talking down one of the hallways. I looked up, asking the nurse and another CNA if they'd heard it too. They both nodded. Concerned that one of the residents might be up and about, I decided to investigate, with the other CNA keeping an eye on the call lights while I checked. After a room-by-room check, I found everyone sound asleep, and there were no TVs or radios on. I returned to the nurse's station, and we agreed it was likely the spirits of past residents chatting among themselves. About 3 or 4 months later, I was on a different hallway doing my 2 a.m. rounds for safety and incontinence checks. As I reached the end of the hall and entered the last room on the left, Larry's room, name changed for privacy. I gathered my supplies and began my work. Larry had limited mobility and struggled to speak, but he could communicate with nods and simple sentences if given time. As I worked, I noticed Larry kept looking at the corner of his room between the sliding glass door and the closet. Curious, I asked, "Larry, what are you looking at?" He replied, "The little girl." I was surprised and asked, "Really?" Larry nodded with a smile, still gazing at the corner. "Does the little girl have a name?" I asked. He nodded again and softly said, "Rachel." When I asked what she looked like, he described her as having blonde pigtails and wearing a blue dress. Smiling, I greeted Rachel and then looked down at Larry, noticing a tear in his eyes. "Why are you tearing up?" I asked him gently. "She wants to play," he said. I smiled, telling him and Rachel it was bedtime and they could play in the morning. After repositioning him, I cleaned up my supplies and returned to the nurse's station to document my rounds. I couldn't shake the encounter, so I asked my coworkers what the residents said about the little girl, specifically if she had a name or any distinctive appearance. They mentioned she was often described with blonde hair and a blue dress, sometimes seen holding a doll. When they'd first told me about her, they hadn't mentioned these details. The following week, I returned to work on that same hallway. As I approached Larry's room, I glanced up from my notes and saw a little girl peeking around his doorway. The initial shock brought tears to my eyes, but once I settled, I entered Larry's room and went about my duties. Larry was tearing up too, and we shared a look that said everything. No words were needed. We both understood that his time was near, and he was ready. On my last round that night, he said, "Rachel is ready for me, and I'm ready to go and play." I looked into his wise, gentle eyes and said, "I know, Larry. You'll have so much fun together. Goodbye." He smiled, visibly at peace. His body had been failing him, trapping him inside, and it seemed he was finally ready to move on. 2 days later, Larry was put on comfort care. By the time I returned to work the following week, he had passed away. I was grateful for the chance to see Rachel and to say goodbye to him in his final days. After Larry passed, I would sometimes feel a comforting presence in his old room. It wasn't constant or unsettling. I like to think it was Larry, stopping by his old home, maybe even checking in on me.